Welcome to my channel Midnight Stories, where you find horror stories that scare you. Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. My name is Thomas Murphy, and I am 70 years old. What I'm about to recount happened to me in October of 2012, forever changing my perception of the wilderness I once loved. I've been a ranger for Everwood Grove National Park since college, drawn to the majestic trees and open sky. The low pay and occasional frustrations with tourists were always outweighed by the raw beauty of nature. Or so I thought, until that fateful autumn day when the very forest I cherished revealed a terrifying secret. It was late afternoon when the call came over the radio. A group of hikers hadn't returned from the ancient Cedars Trail. Two couples from Austria, experienced outdoorsmen who had ventured off the official path in search of more remote vistas. With a sigh, I grabbed one of the park ATVs and headed out, the sun already dipping low on the horizon. Dusk was settling in by the time I reached their last known location. The first thing that struck me as wrong were the backpacks, dumped haphazardly beside a burbling stream. Expensive cameras, supplies, everything you'd need for backcountry hiking, just lying there, abandoned. Even if they'd gotten turned around, no experienced hiker would just ditch their gear. I drew my service pistol, scanning the rapidly darkening woods. The usual evening chorus of birds had fallen eerily silent. Then a sound shattered the stillness, a horrible, piercing cry from deeper in the trees. It was unmistakably human, but with an undercurrent of something else. Raw, desperate, and cut horrifyingly short with a wet gurgle that made my blood run cold. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, to call for backup, but those hikers needed help. Steeling myself, I moved towards the source of the sound, weapon at the ready. As I rounded a bend in the trail, the fading light revealed a scene that still haunts my nightmares. One of the hikers, a woman, lay half-sprawled on the forest floor. Her clothes were torn and blood. There was so much blood spattered in impossible patterns across the leaves and tree trunks. But I couldn't see any obvious wounds. It was as if she'd been ripped apart from the inside out. Before I could process the grotesque sight, movement caught my eye. The trees behind her rustled ominously, and out of the lengthening shadows stepped a bear. But no bear I'd ever encountered in my decades of rangering. This creature was massive, easily 8 feet tall when it reared up on its hind legs. But its size wasn't the most unsettling thing. Its fur was a sickly mottled gray-green, hanging loose as if half-rotted off its frame. And its eyes, God, those eyes. They were an unnatural yellow, with slitted pupils like a snake's, burning with an intelligence and hunger that had nothing to do with mere animal instinct. Training took over. My first shot hit center mass, sending the creature staggering back. The second tore through its shoulder in a spray of dark ichor. It should have been enough to drop any normal bear. Instead, the thing roared, a sound that shook leaves from the trees and reverberated in my chest, and charged. I emptied my entire clip into the monstrosity. Blood sprayed. Chunks of fur and flesh blasted clear off in patches, but it didn't stop. It hurtled towards me, an unstoppable wall of muscle and rage. I ducked as it lunged overhead, the stench of its breath hot on my neck. It slammed into a massive tree trunk with enough force to crack the bark, and I whirled, fumbling for my backup weapon. My fingers slipped on the grip, and the gun tumbled into the damp leaves. In that split second of hesitation, the creature was on me again, a whirlwind of teeth and claws. I screamed as its paw slammed into my side. Pain exploded through me, followed by a weird sensation of my whole body being jerked sideways. With horror, I realized it had caught my gun belt, dragging me across the forest floor. I kicked frantically at its legs, my free hand desperately reaching back for anything to grab onto. My fingers closed around a thick root, and I held on for dear life. The tug-of-war felt like it lasted an eternity. The creature roared, foul drool dripping from its monstrous jaws. My shoulders screamed in protest, but I clung to that root with every ounce of strength I had left. Then, with a sickening tear, my belt ripped away, along with a whole chunk of my uniform. The sudden release sent the creature stumbling, momentarily distracted. I scrambled backward, my hand frantically searching the ground for my dropped pistol. I found it just as the beast regained its footing, those terrible yellow eyes narrowing as they focused on me once more. It let out a guttural snarl that chilled me to my very core and charged. I fired blindly, once, twice, 3 times. I heard wet thudding sounds as the bullets found their mark, and the creature faltered mid-stride. Seizing what I thought was my moment, I aimed again, finger tightening on the trigger. Click. Nothing. The gun was empty. I stared in abject horror as the creature slowly straightened, those unnatural eyes fixed on me with cruel intelligence. There wasn't enough time to reload. It moved with surprising speed, blurring towards me across the ground. I closed my eyes, throwing up an arm in a pitiful attempt at defense as its claws raked down. White-hot pain lanced through me. I felt a burst of searing heat, and then silence. Slowly, I opened my eyes. The creature was gone, vanished as if it had never been there at all. But the evidence of our encounter was all too real. My arm burned like it had been doused in acid, blood soaking my tattered sleeve. I glanced down and immediately regretted it. 3 deep gashes ran down to the bone, and I could see something shiny and white within them. My stomach heaved, and the world began to spin. I stumbled in what I hoped was the direction of the main trail, clutching the ragged edges of my shirt around the wounds. Every few steps, the forest would tilt and swim before my eyes. I must have passed out at some point, because the next thing I remember is waking up under the harsh glare of spotlights in the back of a rescue helicopter. The days that followed were a haze of hospital beds and disbelieving park staff. I recounted my story time and time again, but was met only with concerned looks and hushed conversations about trauma and hallucinations. Rangers combed the area where the attack happened, finding no sign of the creature and no bodies of the other hikers. My shredded gun belt was recovered, but my backup weapon was never found. The doctors did their best to patch me up, but the wounds across my arm were deep. They left angry, jagged scars and a lingering weakness that made it difficult to properly grip my service weapon or even lift heavy gear. After a month of recovery, I was released with a long list of physical therapy appointments and a note restricting me to light duty for the foreseeable future. I moved back into my little cabin on the edge of the park, but it felt different now. Emptier, despite the constant presence of my old dog, Rusty. The memories haunted me. The crushing weight of the creature, its fetid breath, those terrible eyes that spoke of an impossible intelligence. I started leaving the lights on even when I slept, my gun tucked under my pillow. News of the bear attack made the local papers. I got a few calls from reporters hungry for details on the monstrous bear, but I refused to talk. The official ranger's report chalked the whole thing up to a freak encounter with an unusually aggressive or possibly rabid animal. The higher-ups seemed all too eager to close the case and hush up any talk of something more. I tried to go back to work, to pretend everything was normal, but it wasn't. The forest that had once been my sanctuary now felt alien and threatening. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves had me whirling around, fingers hovering over my weapon. My fellow rangers watched me with worried eyes, and I found myself assigned mostly to desk duty, filing paperwork instead of patrolling the wilds I once loved. It grated on me. I'd chosen this life for the freedom of it, the thrill of being out in the untamed wilderness. Now, the very idea of venturing deep into the trees filled me with an unshakable dread. My determination warred constantly with a simmering fear I couldn't quite quell. Weeks passed. I started spending my days off alone, hiking short trails closer to the park boundaries, trying to desensitize myself to the forest. Rusty trotted faithfully by my side, a furry, growling security blanket. Little by little, that knot of anxiety began to loosen. It wasn't gone, would never be fully gone, but it became manageable. Then one crisp autumn afternoon, everything changed again. I was out on a well-traveled trail, one of those wide, graveled affairs that tourists with strollers flock to. Rusty was ahead, nose buried in the undergrowth, when I noticed something odd. A glint of metal, half buried in the dirt just off the path. I bent down and unearthed a mangled pair of eyeglasses. They were high-end and unmistakably of Austrian make. My heart sank as I realized how close we were to where those hikers had disappeared. With trembling hands, I shoved the glasses into my pocket, marked the spot on my GPS, and radioed base camp. This time, the search went hard. Dogs, thermal imaging cameras, the works. 2 days of combing the area turned up a grim discovery in a hidden ravine. The bodies of 3 of the missing hikers, or what was left of them. I wasn't allowed near the scene, but word filtered back. They'd been torn apart, just like that first victim I'd encountered. And something had been gnawing on the bones. Officially, those deaths were added to the bear attack file. But now there was a new directive. Bring in professional wildlife trappers, tranquilize the creature, if it even was a bear, and relocate it far from the park. I watched from a distance as the trappers set up near where I'd found the glasses. Huge metal cages were installed, baited with roadkill. Cameras were rigged up everywhere. They told me to stay away, that the area was off limits until further notice. I agreed, but my nights became restless again. It was still out there, still hunting, and they were going to try to bring it in closer. It happened a week later. I was sitting in my cabin trying to ignore the heavy rain pounding on the roof when my phone buzzed with an emergency alert. The creature had taken the bait. It was in one of the cages, thrashing and raging, and the trappers were en route to sedate it. They wanted me there, the one with previous experience. I couldn't ignore the order, not after how those hikers' remains had been found. With a grim sense of determination, I got into my truck, Rusty whining nervously in the passenger seat. When I reached the site, it was chaos. Searchlights cut through the darkness and driving rain. Shouts carried on the howling wind. The metal cage looked dented, its bars visibly bent. Whatever was inside wasn't just big, it was monstrously strong. The trappers huddled nearby, rifles loaded with tranquilizer darts at the ready. Then, I saw it. A hulking shape emerged from the shadows, illuminated for a brief moment as it passed under a spotlight. Those impossibly long limbs, those glowing eyes. My stomach lurched, but I forced back the bile. I couldn't back down now. "Murphy, stay with the group," yelled one of the trappers. I ignored him, moving cautiously toward the cage. Rusty snarled beside me, hackles raised, straining at his leash. The creature smelled me, knew what I was. A low guttural growl emanated from the cage. I stopped a few feet away, raising my weapon. Not my service pistol this time. This was my father's old hunting rifle. More stopping power. "Get a clear shot ready," I yelled over the roaring wind. The trappers glanced at each other, hesitating. Then, as if sensing weakness, the creature lunged at the bars with a deafening clang. One of the men swore and fired a tranquilizer dart. It bounced harmlessly off the matted fur. The beast roared in fury and lunged again. Time seemed to slow. The metal bars shrieked and buckled. I saw the trappers' faces pale as they realized this cage wasn't going to hold for long. I took aim, squeezing the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the night. The creature staggered, and a low, choking sound emerged from its throat. I fired again and again. It slumped back, a dark mass heaving and twitching within the confines of the cage. The trappers finally came to their senses, swarming closer and firing dart after dart, until the creature went limp. Silence fell, broken only by the drumming of the rain. I lowered the rifle, my hand shaking uncontrollably. I had done it, or so I thought. As I approached the cage, the creature's eyes snapped open, burning with malevolent fury. It had been playing dead. My shout of warning came too late. The weakened bars gave way with a final, mangled groan. The monster burst forth, a whirlwind of claws and teeth and impossible speed. It snatched one of the trappers. I heard a sickening crunch carried on the wind, and then vanished back into the darkness of the forest. The aftermath was a blur of panicked shouts, searchlights cutting wildly through the trees, and the frantic barking of tracking dogs let loose from their leashes. I stumbled back to my truck, shoving a whimpering Rusty inside. I had to get out of there, away from this cursed place. But where do you go when the monsters are real? When the refuge of the wilderness you once loved is forever tainted with blood and death? I left Everwood Grove that night and never returned as a ranger. The official report cited a tragic accident. A bear, driven mad by disease or territory encroachment, responsible for the deaths. The incident was quietly buried. The families of the victims placated with settlements and non-disclosure agreements. But I know the truth. I see those yellow eyes in my dreams, feel phantom pain in the scars that will never fully heal. I've moved far from the forest now, finding what peace I can in the stark openness of the desert. Sometimes, though, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can hear that unearthly roar. And I wonder, is it still out there? Lurking in the shadows of some quiet grove, waiting for unwary hikers to stumble into its domain? Or has it found new hunting grounds closer to the edges of civilization? All I know is this: the wilderness holds secrets darker and more ancient than we can imagine. And sometimes it's best to leave them undisturbed. My name is Richard Coleman, and I am 72 years old. What I'm about to recount happened to me in September of 2016, but the nightmares it spawned have haunted me every night since. I've been with the National Park Service for nearly a decade, starting out in Red Rock Canyon National Park with its ochre cliffs and blistering heat. But a couple of years back, I transferred to Evernight National Forest in Oregon. I loved the deep emerald canopy, the constant mist, and the hushed whispers of the ancient trees. Most of my job was mundane: trail maintenance, radio communications, supply requests, and the occasional lecture to overzealous campers about fire safety. Sometimes when the weather turned foul, there'd be search and rescue operations for lost hikers. But what transpired that fall? Well, there's no training manual for that kind of horror. It began with the reports: hikers returning with wild stories, odd sounds in the night, a sense of being watched, glimpses of hulking figures just beyond the tree line. At first it was easy to dismiss, tired minds playing tricks in the dense forest. But after the third, fourth, fifth report, with near-identical details, that uneasy feeling started gnawing at my gut. The incident that set everything in motion involved a family, the Hargroves. 2 parents, 3 kids, the usual overloaded backpacks and squabbles over trail mix. They got a late start on a planned 3-day loop, figuring they could complete it before a forecasted storm. They never made it out. When they were 2 days overdue, their emergency beacon still silent, my partner Ethan and I were sent to find them. We hiked their planned route, scouring the woods. On the morning of the 3rd day, we stumbled upon their campsite, or what was left of it. The tent looked like it had been torn apart by a wild animal, belongings scattered across the forest floor. No blood. That was the odd part, but something else sent shivers down my spine. We found footprints, huge things, far larger than any human foot, and claw marks gouged into the bark of a nearby tree. Right then, I knew with chilling certainty that the hiker reports weren't drunken ramblings or overactive imaginations. Our calls for the Hargrove family went unanswered. We tracked their trail deeper into the woods, Ethan's rifle at the ready. With every step, that sense of unease grew stronger, a prickling at the back of my neck. We weren't alone out here. By mid-afternoon, the rain began, a light drizzle at first, then steadily growing heavier. Visibility worsened, the thick canopy of leaves overhead reducing the daylight to an eerie twilight. We pushed on, the only sound the rhythmic crunch of our boots on the sodden earth and the relentless drum of the rain. Then we heard it, a low growl echoing through the trees. The hair on my arm stood on end. Ethan and I exchanged a look, a silent question hanging in the air. We moved closer, rifles raised, our senses on high alert. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the crashing of undergrowth just ahead. We froze, straining to see through the gloom. Then it emerged from the mist-shrouded forest. It was huge, a towering mass of muscle and tangled dark fur. Its height was impossible, at least 8 feet even when hunched. It moved with unnatural fluidity, long limbs stretching the ground it covered with each terrifying stride. But it was the eyes that haunted me, burning yellow orbs devoid of any warmth or animal recognition. They focused on us, and a primal sort of terror seized me. "Easy, easy," I whispered to Ethan, though we both knew it was pointless. This wasn't a bear or a cougar gone rogue. This was something else, something old and unnatural, its lips peeled back in a snarl, revealing rows of jagged teeth, far too long for any animal I knew. And then it charged. We fired, both of us, the sound of the shots deafening in the rain-soaked forest. The creature let out a roar that shook the very trees, the sound both guttural and filled with an unsettling, chilling intelligence. One of the bullets seemed to make contact, the creature stumbling slightly, but it didn't stop its advance. Ethan yelled for me to run. I didn't need telling twice. Panic fueled my flight. Roots snagged at my feet, but I kept moving, propelled by blind terror. The sound of the creature crashing through the forest behind me only spurred me on. I could hear Ethan's shouts, growing fainter. He'd been buying me time. I stumbled out onto a narrow dirt road, a stroke of pure luck. A truck rumbled past and I flagged it down frantically. The driver, a grizzled logging foreman, stared at me, wild-eyed and covered in mud, but he didn't hesitate. He hauled me into the cab and we sped off, the sound of the downpour pounding on the roof. I reported everything back at the ranger station. Official accounts put it down as an animal attack. Ethan's body was never found, swallowed whole by the wilderness. They offered me counseling, time off, but I just wanted back out there. It didn't make sense, I knew that. But the thought of that creature still roaming free, lurking in the shadows of the forest, set a cold fire in my belly. They wouldn't let me go back alone. My new partner Jackson was green, kept a wary eye on me like I was one step away from snapping completely. He wasn't wrong. I caught myself scanning the trees every time we were out on patrol, studying animal tracks for any sign of those impossibly large footprints, listening for any hint of that chilling, guttural growl. Weeks turned into months, and the constant vigilance wore me down. Every creak in my cabin at night sent jolts of terror through me. I'd wake gasping for air, convinced its monstrous yellow eyes were staring in through the window. Jackson noticed the change, the dark circles under my eyes, the way I flinched at every sudden sound. He was a good guy, trying his best within the confines of standard procedure. But we both knew there was no procedure for what we'd seen out there. Then came the whispers, carried on the wind by other hikers, hunters, and those who lived on the fringes of the forest. Sightings of a giant shadowy figure, reports of livestock being torn apart, and eerie howls piercing the night air. The official explanation remained: wild animal, likely a rogue bear. The local papers picked up the story, fueling speculation and fear that simmered just beneath the surface of normalcy. I sought out those who had similar tales. A grizzled old hunter who claimed to have seen it from his tree stand, a backpacker whose friend vanished during a night hike, their bodies never found. We became an unofficial society, bound by a shared trauma nobody else truly understood. We kept records, mapped sightings, pored over old folklore, desperate for any clue as to what we were up against. One moonless night, driven by a mix of recklessness and desperation, I ventured back into the woods alone. Armed with my rifle, a hunting knife that felt pathetically small, and a battered flashlight, I returned to the clearing where we'd first encountered the creature. The rain-washed ground showed no trace of the struggle, but the memory was burned into my mind with brutal clarity. "Richard, what the hell are you doing out here?" Jackson's voice cracked through the darkness, laced with an odd mix of anger and fear. He must have been following me. The thought brought a flicker of warmth amidst the gnawing tension. "Had to see it for myself," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Needed to be sure I wasn't going crazy." He didn't reply, but I heard him moving closer, the rustle of leaves under his boots. We stood there in silence, the air thick with unspoken understanding and the lurking presence of the forest. Then the growl, deep, rumbling, echoing through the trees. I spun, raising my rifle, but the darkness was impenetrable. My flashlight beam cut a swath across the damp undergrowth, revealing nothing. "It's circling us," Jackson's voice was tight. We moved back to back, scanning the impenetrable shadows, the silence broken only by our ragged breaths and the frantic pounding of our hearts. Minutes stretched into eternity. We held our position, waiting for the inevitable attack. But then the growl faded, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the woods. It was gone, at least for now. We retreated back to my cabin, a wordless agreement settling between us. The unspoken question lingered in the air. What did we do now? In the harsh light of my living room, surrounded by familiar objects and the normalcy I'd clung to, there were only two options: stay and fight or turn and run. We chose to fight. The next few weeks were a blur of planning, preparation, and defiance against the bureaucratic red tape that threatened to smother any action. We reached out to our network of believers, gathering them in my shadowy cabin, the hunter, the backpacker, a local woman steeped in indigenous lore. We pooled our knowledge, our theories, and our fears. The creature, we came to realize, wasn't merely a predator. It was intelligent, cunning. The missing persons, the torn livestock, it was marking territory, driving fear into the hearts of those who dared tread within its domain. And if we didn't act, its territory and its reign of terror would only grow. We made a plan, a reckless, desperate plan, born out of a shared, unspoken acceptance that we might not all survive this. Our ragtag group, armed with hunting rifles, old knives, and a fierce determination, set out into the heart of the encroaching darkness. The forest felt different this time, not only alive but hostile, aware of our presence. We followed where the sightings led, where the creature had left its monstrous footprints and haunting growls. Each step was a calculated risk, each rustle of leaves a potential ambush. When it came, the encounter was both terrifying and anticlimactic. It emerged from the dense fog, its hulking form dwarfing us all. Its eyes gleamed with that same chilling light, fixing on us with what felt like malevolent intent. We fired. The shots rang out in the clearing, a staccato of defiance. The creature let out a roar that rattled the leaves, but it didn't fall. It lurched forward, a wounded, enraged beast, but also something more. There was a flicker in its eyes, something akin to surprise, perhaps even a tinge of fear. It turned then, not in retreat, but in a tactical maneuver I recognized from countless nature documentaries. It wasn't alone. Two more figures materialized from the mist, just as large, just as monstrous. That was our breaking point. Outnumbered and outgunned, we ran. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The park was closed indefinitely. Government agents descended, silencing witnesses, sanitizing accounts. Our group scattered, forced back into the shadows. We became the whispered legend, the crazy park rangers who saw monsters in the woods. Jackson vanished. Some say he left the country. Others swear they've seen him venturing back to the edge of the woods, eyes fixed on the tree line. I'm still here. My cabin feels less like a sanctuary and more like a cage within a vast encroaching wilderness. The creature, or creatures, haven't been seen in some time. The official word is that the threat is gone, but I know better. Sometimes at night, when the trees creak and groan in the wind, I think I hear the echo of that blood-curdling roar. I keep my rifle loaded, waiting, because in the darkest corners of the forest the boundary has shifted. We are no longer the undisputed apex predators, and the uneasy truce between man and nature has shattered, leaving an untamed, monstrous wilderness, and those who dare to walk its shadowed paths forever changed. As I sit here penning these words, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. The shadows in the corner of my cabin seem to writhe and twist, taking on impossible forms. Is it my imagination, or do I see the glint of yellow eyes peering at me through the window? I know now that our encounter in the forest was just the beginning. Whatever lurks out there in the depths of Evernight National Forest is patient, ancient, and far more cunning than we ever imagined. It's biding its time, waiting for us to lower our guard, to forget the terror it instilled in our hearts. But I won't forget. I can't. The nightmares won't let me. To whoever reads this account, consider it a warning. The wilderness isn't just indifferent to our presence. In some places, it's actively hostile. There are corners of this world where humanity's dominion is nothing but a comforting illusion, easily shattered by the reality of what truly rules the dark. If you find yourself in Evernight National Forest, or any place where the trees grow too close and the shadows seem to move of their own accord, remember my story. And if you hear a growl that sends shivers down your spine and makes your primal instincts scream for you to run, don't hesitate. Because by the time you see those burning yellow eyes, it'll already be too late. The year was 1994, and I, Oliver Blackwood, had just stepped off the rickety bus that had carried me deep into the heart of Crimson Gorge National Park. Fresh out of college with a degree in environmental science and a head full of idealistic notions, I was ready to make my mark on the world. Little did I know that the world, or at least this small, forgotten corner of it, was about to leave an indelible mark on me. Crimson Gorge wasn't exactly the stuff of postcards. It was a rugged, unforgiving landscape of jagged cliffs, dense forests, and hidden ravines, the kind of place where even experienced hikers thought twice before venturing too far from the main trails. But to me it was beautiful, wild, untamed. I saw it as a canvas waiting for my conservationist brush. As I lugged my oversized backpack towards the ranger station, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of excitement mixed with nervous anticipation. This was it, my first real job. No more lecture halls or theoretical debates about ecosystem management. I was about to get my hands dirty, literally and figuratively. The ranger station was a weathered log cabin that looked like it had been standing since before the park was even established. Its windows, clouded with age and grime, reflected the fading sunlight like tired eyes. As I approached, the door creaked open, and out stepped a man who looked as old and weathered as the cabin itself. "You must be the new guy," he grunted, eyeing me up and down. "Oliver, right?" I nodded, trying to appear more confident than I felt. "Yes, sir. Oliver Blackwood, reporting for duty." The old ranger snorted. "Sir, do I look like a sir to you, boy? Name's Frank Hollister. I've been rangering these parts since before your daddy was in diapers, I reckon." Frank's leathery face crinkled into what I assumed was meant to be a smile, but looked more like a grimace. He gestured for me to follow him inside the station. The interior of the cabin was dim and musty, filled with outdated maps, faded wildlife posters, and the acrid smell of old coffee. Frank shuffled over to a cluttered desk and rummaged through a stack of papers. "Here's your assignment," he said, thrusting a folder into my hands. "You'll be stationed at Outpost 17. It's about 7 miles in, up near Raven's Peak, only accessible by the old fire road, and let me tell you, that road turns into a damn slip and slide after a good rain." I flipped through the folder, trying to absorb the information. Outpost 17 seemed to be one of the most remote stations in the park, responsible for patrolling a vast stretch of wilderness. "Your main job," Frank continued, "is to make sure the tourists don't do anything stupid. Keep them on the trails, away from the cliffs, and out of the mouths of bears. Simple enough, right?" I nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation. This was exactly the kind of challenge I had been hoping for. Frank's expression suddenly turned serious. "One more thing, kid. The wilderness, it ain't like the textbooks. It's got its own rules, its own way of doing things. You respect it, and maybe, just maybe, it'll respect you back. But you get cocky and—" He trailed off, his eyes distant, as if remembering something he'd rather forget. I swallowed hard, feeling a chill despite the stuffy warmth of the cabin. "I understand, sir. I mean, Frank. I'll be careful." He nodded, seemingly satisfied. "All right then, get your gear sorted. You head out at first light tomorrow." As I left the ranger station, the sun was dipping below the jagged horizon, painting the sky in hues of deep red that gave Crimson Gorge its name. The beauty of it took my breath away, but there was something else too, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. It was as if the encroaching darkness held secrets, whispers of things unseen and unknown. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to first-day jitters. I was here to protect this wilderness, to be its guardian and steward. What could there possibly be to fear? Oh, how naive I was. How utterly, blissfully unaware of the horrors that awaited me in the depths of Crimson Gorge. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand the full weight of what happened that summer, you need to know it all, from the beginning. So let me take you back to that first night, as I lay in my temporary bunk, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the forest, the hooting of owls, the rustling of nocturnal creatures, and underneath it all, a silence so profound it seemed to pulse with its own life. Little did I know that this silence was merely the calm before a storm of terror that would change me forever. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of day that makes you believe anything is possible. I loaded up the Park Service Jeep with my gear, said a quick goodbye to Frank, and set off down the fire road towards Outpost 17. The drive was an adventure in itself. The road, if you could call it that, was little more than a rough track cut through the wilderness. It wound its way up steep inclines, skirted perilous drop-offs, and crossed babbling streams on rickety wooden bridges that creaked ominously under the Jeep's weight. As I drove deeper into the park, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees grew taller, their canopies blocking out much of the sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight on the forest floor. The air grew thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was nearly noon when I finally arrived at Outpost 17. The outpost turned out to be a small two-room cabin perched on the edge of a clearing. It wasn't much to look at: weathered logs, a slightly sagging roof, and windows that had seen better days. But to me, it was perfect. This would be my home for the next few months, my base of operations as I worked to protect this slice of wilderness. I spent the rest of the day settling in, unpacking my gear, and familiarizing myself with the equipment left by the previous ranger. There was a powerful radio for communicating with the main station, emergency supplies, and a well-worn trail guide that detailed the various hiking routes in my patrol area. As evening approached, I decided to take a short hike to get a feel for the terrain. The main trail led from my cabin down to Raven's Creek, a fast-moving stream that cut through the heart of my patrol zone. The hike was invigorating, the forest alive with the sounds of birds and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I reached the creek just as the sun was beginning to set. The water gurgled and splashed over smooth river rocks, creating a soothing symphony. I sat on a large boulder, letting the peace of the moment wash over me. This, I thought, was why I had chosen this career: to be surrounded by such raw, untamed beauty, to play a part in preserving it for future generations. As I sat there, lost in my thoughts, a movement on the opposite bank caught my eye. At first I thought it was just a deer or maybe a black bear, both common in these parts. But as I focused on the spot, I realized it was something else entirely. For just a moment I saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. It was tall, much taller than a man, and seemed to be covered in dark matted fur. But it was the eyes that sent a chill down my spine, 2 pinpoints of reflected light, watching me with an intelligence that seemed far from animal. I blinked, and in that instant, it was gone, vanished into the deepening shadows of the forest as if it had never been there at all. My heart was pounding as I quickly made my way back to the cabin. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the fading light, my imagination running wild in this new, unfamiliar environment. But deep down, a seed of unease had been planted, a feeling that something wasn't quite right in the depths of Crimson Gorge. That night, as I lay in my bunk listening to the wind whisper through the trees, I couldn't shake the image of those eyes from my mind. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. The true horrors of Crimson Gorge were yet to reveal themselves. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. I settled into a routine, patrolling the trails, assisting hikers, and keeping an eye out for any signs of trouble. The work was demanding but rewarding. Each day brought new challenges and experiences, from helping lost campers find their way back to the main trails to relocating a particularly stubborn black bear that had developed a taste for unattended picnic baskets. I tried to put the incident at the creek out of my mind, chalking it up to an overactive imagination and the natural disorientation of being in a new place. But every now and then, especially in the quiet hours of the night, I'd find myself thinking about those eyes in the darkness, and a chill would run down my spine. It was about a month into my stay at Outpost 17 when the first real trouble started. I was in the middle of my morning radio check-in with the main station when Frank's voice crackled over the airwaves, sounding more serious than I'd ever heard him. "Oliver, we've got a situation. 2 hikers, Mark and Emily Chen, checked in for a 3-day trek along the Crimson Ridge Trail. They were due back yesterday but never showed. Their car's still in the parking lot. I need you to start a search of your sector." My stomach tightened. This was what I'd trained for, but the reality of it was far more nerve-wracking than any simulation. "Understood, Frank. I'm on it. Any other details I should know?" "Just that they're experienced hikers, not the type to get lost easily. Keep your eyes peeled for anything unusual. And Oliver, be careful out there." There was something in Frank's tone that sent another chill through me. It was as if he knew something he wasn't telling me, some dark secret about the park that he was holding back. I gathered my search and rescue gear and set out along the Crimson Ridge Trail. The trail was challenging, winding its way along steep cliffs and through dense patches of old-growth forest. As I hiked, calling out for Mark and Emily every few minutes, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Several hours into the search, I came across their campsite. It was in a small clearing not far from the trail. At first glance, everything seemed normal: a tent, a cold fire pit, backpacks leaning against a tree. But as I got closer, I realized something was very wrong. The tent had been torn open from the outside, great claw marks rending the fabric as if it were tissue paper. The backpacks were in tatters, their contents strewn about the clearing. And there, on the edge of the campsite, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. But not human footprints, and not like any animal tracks I'd ever seen. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, with long curved claw marks at the end of each toe. They led from the forest to the campsite, circled the destroyed tent, and then disappeared back into the undergrowth. My hands shook as I radioed back to Frank. I found the campsite, I stammered. Frank, something attacked them, something big. There was a long pause before Frank responded, his voice grim. Get out of there, Oliver, now. Come on back to the station, we need to talk. I didn't need to be told twice. As I hurried back down the trail, my mind raced with possibilities. A bear? No, the tracks were all wrong for that. A mountain lion? Again, not even close. Whatever had done this was something I'd never encountered before, something that shouldn't exist in these woods or anywhere else. As I drove back to the main station, the forest seemed to press in around me, darker and more menacing than ever before. The beauty I had admired just that morning now seemed like a mask, hiding something ancient and malevolent beneath its surface. I arrived at the station just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood red. Frank was waiting for me on the porch, his face etched with worry and something else, fear. Come on inside, kid, he said, his voice heavy. There's something you need to know about Crimson Gorge, something we don't tell the tourists or even most of the rangers. But after what you've seen today, well, you deserve to know the truth. As I followed Frank into the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was crossing a threshold. That once I heard what he had to say, there would be no going back. The horrors of Crimson Gorge were about to be revealed, and my life would never be the same. The interior of the ranger station felt different now, oppressive and filled with unspoken dread. Frank motioned for me to sit down as he locked the door behind us. He moved to a cabinet in the corner, unlocked it with a key he wore around his neck, and pulled out a dusty old bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. You're gonna need this, he said, pouring a generous amount into each glass. He handed one to me and downed his in a single gulp before refilling it. I sipped at mine, the burn of the alcohol doing little to calm my nerves. Frank settled into the chair across from me, his eyes distant, lost in memories I couldn't begin to imagine. Crimson Gorge has been my home for over 40 years, he began, his voice low and gravelly. I've seen things in these woods that would turn your hair white, things that don't belong in this world, let alone in a national park. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room, understand? As far as the outside world is concerned, Crimson Gorge is just another wilderness area with its share of normal dangers, bears, cougars, the occasional lost hiker. But the truth is far worse. I nodded, unable to speak, my throat dry despite the whiskey. Frank took a deep breath and continued. It started back in the 50s. The park had just been established and they sent in survey teams to map out the area. One of those teams went into a part of the gorge we now call the Dead Zone. 5 men went in. Only one came out, and he was changed, babbling about creatures in the shadows, things with too many legs and eyes that glowed in the dark. He paused, taking another swig of whiskey. They wrote it off as exposure, dehydration, maybe some kind of toxic fungus. But then it happened again and again. Over the years, we've lost dozens of people to whatever's out there. Hikers, campers, even a few rangers. My mind was reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of elaborate hazing ritual for new rangers. But the look in Frank's eyes, the tremble in his weathered hands as he poured another drink, this was no joke. What are they? I managed to ask. Frank shook his head. We don't know, not really. Some say they're some kind of undiscovered species, holdovers from a prehistoric age. Others think they're something not natural, not from this world. He shuddered visibly. All we know is that they're intelligent, they're strong, and they're hungry. He stood up abruptly, moving to a large map of the park pinned to the wall. We've managed to identify some of their hunting grounds, areas where the disappearances are most common. We steer visitors away from these spots, close trails when we have to. But sometimes, like with your missing hikers, they venture out further. I thought back to the destroyed campsite, the massive inhuman footprints. Is there any hope for the Chens? Frank's silence was answer enough. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation. We'll send out a search party tomorrow, make it look good for the reports. But between you and me, those poor folks are already gone. The weight of this knowledge settled over me like a shroud. Everything I thought I knew about my job, about this park, had been turned upside down in the span of an hour. The next morning dawned gray and misty, as if the park itself was in mourning for the missing Chens. I met Frank and a small group of other rangers at the trailhead, our faces grim with the knowledge of what we were likely to find, or rather what we wouldn't find. As we hiked deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every snap of a twig underfoot made me flinch. The other rangers seemed equally on edge, their eyes darting from shadow to shadow, hands never straying far from their sidearms. We reached the Chens' campsite by midday. The scene was much as I had left it, but somehow even more eerie in the flat gray light. The other rangers went about their work with a mechanical efficiency, photographing the site, collecting samples, looking for any clues as to the couple's fate. I found myself drawn to the edge of the clearing where I had first spotted those monstrous tracks. They were still there, pressed deep into the soft earth. As I crouched down to examine them more closely, I noticed something I had missed before. A faint, oily sheen in the depths of the prints, giving off a subtle, sickly sweet odor. "Don't touch it," Frank's voice came from behind me, making me jump. "That residue, it's toxic, causes hallucinations among other things." I pulled my hand back quickly, suddenly aware of how close I'd come to making contact with the substance. Is this from them?" I asked, unable to keep the tremor from my voice. Frank nodded grimly. "It's how they mark their territory, how they communicate with each other, and how they lure in their prey." The implications of his words sent a chill down my spine. These weren't just animals acting on instinct. These were intelligent predators with complex behaviors and hunting strategies. Our search continued until dusk, but as Frank had predicted, we found no trace of the Chens beyond their ruined campsite. As we made our way back to the trailhead, the shadows seemed to grow longer, deeper, more menacing with each step. That night, back in my cabin at Outpost 17, I lay awake for hours, jumping at every sound from the forest outside. The horrors I had learned about, the reality of what lurked in the depths of Crimson Gorge, had shattered my perception of this place I had come to love. But little did I know my true test was yet to come. Weeks passed, and life in Crimson Gorge settled into an uneasy routine. We went about our duties, maintaining trails, assisting visitors, conducting patrols, but always with one eye on the shadows, always alert for signs of the unspeakable horrors that lurked in the park's darkest corners. It was on one such routine patrol that my world changed forever. I was checking a remote trail near Raven's Peak, an area Frank had warned me was dangerously close to one of the creature's known hunting grounds. The day was overcast, a light drizzle turning the forest floor slick and treacherous. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I came to an abrupt halt. There, not 20 yards ahead of me, stood something that defied description. It was tall, easily 8 feet or more, with a body that seemed to shift and writhe even as it stood still. Its skin, if you could call it that, was a mottled gray-green, glistening with the same oily substance I had seen in the footprints. But it was the creature's face that seared itself into my memory. A nightmarish blend of insect and reptile, with far too many eyes, all fixed unblinkingly upon me. A mouth filled with row upon row of needle-sharp teeth parted in what I can only describe as a grin. I stood frozen, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. The creature took a step forward, its movement unnaturally fluid. In that moment my paralysis broke, and I did the only thing I could. I ran. I tore through the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. Behind me I could hear the creature in pursuit, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for its size. Its rasping breath and the cracking of undergrowth spurred me on, terror lending wings to my feet. I don't know how long I ran or even in what direction. My world had narrowed to the pounding of my heart, the burning in my lungs and the primal need to escape. When I finally burst out of the tree line into a small clearing, I realized with a jolt of horror that I recognized where I was. I had run in a circle, ending up back near my cabin. As I sprinted towards the relative safety of Outpost 17, I risked a glance over my shoulder. The creature was there at the edge of the clearing, but it had stopped. It stood watching me, those multitude of eyes gleaming with an intelligence that chilled me to my core. I slammed the cabin door behind me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the locks. For hours I huddled in the corner, my rifle clutched to my chest, waiting for the inevitable attack. But it never came. When dawn finally broke, I peered out the window to find the clearing empty. But there, in the soft earth before my cabin, was a single, massive footprint, a reminder and a warning. In the days that followed, I grappled with what I had seen. Part of me wanted to flee, to leave Crimson Gorge and its horrors far behind. But a deeper part, a part I hadn't known existed until that moment, knew I couldn't abandon this place. I thought of the visitors who came to Crimson Gorge, blissfully unaware of the dangers that lurked in its shadows. I thought of my fellow rangers, standing as the thin line between those horrors and the unsuspecting world beyond. And I knew what I had to do. I radioed Frank and told him everything. To his credit, he listened without interruption, his silence speaking volumes. When I finished, he let out a long, weary sigh. "You've seen them now," he said, his voice heavy with a mixture of resignation and respect. "There's no going back from that. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the words I was about to say. "I'm staying, Frank. These things, whatever they are, someone has to stand against them. Someone has to protect people from them. If not us, then who?" There was a long pause on the other end of the radio. When Frank spoke again, I could hear the pride in his voice. "Welcome to the real Crimson Gorge Ranger Service, kid. God help us all." In the months and years that followed, I came to understand the true nature of my job. We weren't just protectors of the wilderness. We were guardians against forces beyond human understanding. We patrolled the boundaries between our world and something older, darker, infinitely more terrifying. There were more encounters, more losses, nights spent huddled in cabins or fire towers, listening to inhuman cries echoing through the valleys. Days spent fabricating stories to explain away the inexplicable, to maintain the illusion of normalcy for the sake of the public and our own sanity. But through it all, we stood our ground. In the face of horrors that would drive most men mad, we held the line. Because that's what it means to be a ranger in Crimson Gorge. That's the oath we take, the burden we bear. Even now, years later, as I sit in my cabin writing this account, I can feel them out there, watching, waiting. The shadows of Crimson Gorge are never far away, and the night is always dark with threats untold. But we'll be here, standing guard in the darkness, because someone has to, because the alternative is unthinkable. So if you ever find yourself in Crimson Gorge, enjoying its majestic beauty, take a moment to nod to the rangers you see. We're more than just guides and guardians of nature. We're the thin green line between you and horrors beyond imagination. And remember, stick to the trails, respect the wilderness, and whatever you do, don't go out after dark. Some shadows are best left unexplored. I never thought my life would turn into a horror story. Then again, I never thought I'd trade my stable accounting job for a life on the road either. But here I am, Jason Fletcher, former number cruncher turned full-time nomad, recounting the most terrifying experience of my life. It all started innocently enough. After years of staring at spreadsheets under fluorescent lights, I decided to break free. I bought a modest RV, lovingly dubbed Gertrude, and set out to explore the country. For 2 years, it was bliss. National parks, quirky small towns, roadside attractions, I saw it all. But it was that fateful trip to the dense forests of Oregon that changed everything. I found the perfect spot to park Gertrude, a secluded clearing next to a babbling brook, surrounded by towering Douglas firs that seemed to touch the sky. The first day was idyllic. I set up camp, hiked a nearby trail, and settled in for the night with a good book and a glass of whiskey. That's when I first felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if someone was watching me. I dismissed it as paranoia, the product of too much solitude and an overactive imagination. But as I climbed into bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next morning I woke to find my camping chair missing. Not just moved, completely gone. I searched the entire area, thinking maybe a curious animal had dragged it off, but found nothing. Unsettled, I decided to go for a hike to clear my head. The forest was beautiful, but I couldn't fully appreciate it. Every snapping twig made me jump. Every rustle of leaves had me spinning around. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. That's when I saw it, a figure hunched over my extinguished campfire. Before I could call out, it vanished into the underbrush. Heart pounding, I rushed into Gertrude and locked the door. Sleep was impossible that night. Every sound from the forest seemed amplified, sinister. When dawn finally broke, I didn't hesitate. I packed up and drove Gertrude to a new spot about 10 miles away, hoping to leave whatever or whoever I'd seen behind. The new location was more open, with a stunning view of a valley. I tried to relax, even setting up my hammock between two trees to do some reading. But the peace was short-lived. Mid-afternoon, I heard footsteps crunching through leaves nearby. Peering over the edge of the hammock, my blood ran cold. There, propped against a tree, was my missing camping chair. Panic set in. This was no coincidence, no simple misunderstanding. Someone was toying with me, following me. I abandoned the hammock, threw my belongings into Gertrude, and took off down the forest road, desperately seeking civilization. But the deeper I drove, the narrower the roads became. Trees pressed in on both sides, their branches scraping against Gertrude's sides like grasping fingers. My cell phone lost signal. Isolation closed in around me like a vice. Then, rounding a bend, I saw it, a massive tree trunk blocking the entire road. There was no way around, no way through. Panic clawed at my throat as I realized I'd have to turn back, to drive past whatever was hunting me. I whipped Gertrude around and floored it. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every curve in the road promised danger. It felt like hours before I finally burst out onto a main highway, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I didn't stop driving until I reached a bustling truck stop, its fluorescent lights and crowd of people the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. I called the police, but what could I tell them? That someone had moved my chair, that I'd seen a shadow. They took my statement, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. That night, in a cheap motel room with the TV blaring for company, I tried to make sense of it all. Who would go to such lengths to terrorize a random traveler, and why? The questions kept me awake long into the night. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I parked Gertrude, I imagined eyes peering out from the trees. I started seeing threats everywhere, in the glance of a gas station attendant, in the wave of a fellow RV owner. Paranoia consumed me. I began to doubt my own memories. Had I really seen a figure by the campfire, or was my mind playing tricks? But then I'd remember the chair, appearing miles from where I'd lost it, and the cold fear would return. I knew I couldn't keep running forever. The open road, once my escape, now felt like a trap. Every mile I drove could be leading me further into danger, or worse, bringing the danger to some unsuspecting town. That's when I made the hardest decision of my life. I had to get rid of Gertrude. She was too conspicuous, too easy to track. I found a junkyard willing to take her, no questions asked. Watching her being towed away felt like losing a piece of myself, but I knew it was necessary. With the cash from selling Gertrude, I bought a nondescript sedan. I ditched most of my belongings, keeping only what would fit in the trunk. I became a ghost, paying for everything in cash, never staying in one place for more than a night. Weeks passed. Slowly, the constant fear began to subside. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I'd left the nightmare behind in those Oregon forests. Then, driving down a lonely stretch of desert highway, I saw it. An old pickup truck passed me going the other way, and there in the bed, bouncing along without a care in the world, was my camping chair. For a moment I considered turning around, following the truck, confronting whoever was behind this twisted game. But what good would it do? What could I prove? And if there were more of them out there? No, I decided. The only way forward was to keep moving, to stay alert, stay cautious, but not let the fear control me. I watched the pickup disappear into the shimmering heat haze, taking with it the last physical evidence of my ordeal. The open road still calls to me, but it's different now. There's a shadow over it that I'm not sure will ever fully lift, but I refuse to let them win. Whoever they are, whatever their game was, they don't get to take this life from me. So I keep driving, eyes on the road, always scanning the rearview mirror, and I never ever stop moving forward. Because out here, in the vast expanse of America's highways and byways, you never know who or what might be right behind you. The desert stretched endlessly before me, a shimmering mirage of heat and dust. I'd been driving for hours, the monotony of the landscape broken only by the occasional cactus or weather-beaten road sign. My hands ached from gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension. It had been 3 days since I'd seen my camping chair in the back of that pickup truck. 3 days of constantly looking over my shoulder, of jumping at every shadow. Sleep came in fitful bursts, always in the car, never for more than an hour or two at a time. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but the fear of stopping for too long kept me moving. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I spotted a small gas station on the horizon. My fuel gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty, and my stomach growled in protest of the meager snacks I'd been subsisting on. I had to stop. The neon open sign flickered weakly as I pulled up to the pump. The station looked like it had seen better days, paint peeling, one of the pumps covered in a tattered, out-of-order sign. A bell chimed as I pushed open the door to the small convenience store attached to the station. The clerk, an older man with a scraggly gray beard, barely looked up from his newspaper as I entered. I grabbed a few bottles of water, some energy bars, and a bag of beef jerky before approaching the counter. "That'll be $23.50, the clerk drawled, finally meeting my gaze. His eyes narrowed slightly. "You all right, son? Look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a weak smile. "Just tired. Long drive." He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving my face. "Where you headed?" "East," I replied vaguely, handing over some crumpled bills. The clerk's weathered hand brushed against mine as he took the money, and I had to suppress a shudder. Asterisk. "Get a grip, Jason," I chided myself. Asterisk. "Not everyone is out to get you." As he counted out my change, the clerk spoke again. "You know, we don't get many strangers out this way, especially not ones looking as spooked as you do." My heart rate quickened. "Like I said, just tired. Thanks for the supplies." I turned to leave, but his next words stopped me cold. "Funny thing happened the other day. Another fella came through asking about someone matching your description. Said his asterisk friend asterisk had gone missing, wanted to know if I'd seen him." I slowly turned back to face the clerk, my mouth suddenly dry. "Oh," was all I could manage. The old man nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yep, tall guy, dark hair, driving a beat-up sedan. Sound familiar?" My mind raced. How had they found me? How far behind were they? I needed to get out of here now. "No, sorry," I lied, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. "Doesn't ring a bell. Thanks again." I practically ran out of the store, the bell clanging loudly behind me. As I fumbled with the gas pump, I could feel the clerk's eyes on me through the grimy store window. Just as I finished filling up, a truck appeared on the horizon, growing larger as it approached the station. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't the same truck I'd seen before, but the sight of any pickup was enough to send my heart racing. I jumped into my car, hands shaking as I turned the key. The engine sputtered once, twice, before roaring to life. I peeled out of the station just as the truck pulled in, gravel spraying behind me. In my rearview mirror, I saw the truck's driver emerge, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a cowboy hat. He stood watching my retreat, one hand resting casually on the door of his vehicle. Even from a distance, I could feel the weight of his gaze. I drove through the night, sleep be damned. Every set of headlights in my mirror was a potential threat. Every car I passed could be asterisk them asterisk. The vastness of the desert, which had seemed oppressive before, now felt like my only ally. Out here, at least, it was harder for someone to sneak up on me. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, I spotted a sign for a small town ahead. Millerville, population 2,500. I needed rest, desperately, but the thought of stopping made my skin crawl. Still, I knew I couldn't keep going like this. I had to find somewhere safe to hole up, at least for a few hours. The town was just waking up as I rolled down its main street. A few early risers were opening shops, and the smell of fresh bread wafted from a small bakery. It all seemed so normal, so peaceful. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, I'd outrun my pursuers. I found a small motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that didn't ask too many questions as long as you had cash. The room was shabby but clean, with heavy curtains that blocked out the morning light. I did a thorough check under the bed, in the closet, behind the shower curtain, before allowing myself to relax slightly. Exhaustion hit me like a freight train. I could barely keep my eyes open as I pushed the room's single armchair in front of the door. It wasn't much of a barricade, but it would at least wake me if someone tried to enter. As I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, my last coherent thought was a question that had been plaguing me for weeks. Asterisk. Who were these people, and what did they want from me? I jolted awake, heart pounding, unsure of what had disturbed my sleep. The room was dark, the heavy curtains still drawn against the outside world. For a moment I lay perfectly still, straining my ears for any sound out of place. There, a soft scraping noise from outside my door. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly, silently eased myself out of bed. The cheap alarm clock on the nightstand read 3:47 p.m. I'd slept for nearly 8 hours, longer than I had in weeks. The scraping came again, followed by a muffled thud. Someone was definitely out there. I crept towards the door, careful to avoid the creaky floorboard I'd noticed earlier. The chair I'd pushed against the door hadn't moved. Hard in my throat, I pressed my eye to the peephole. The hallway outside was dimly lit, but I could make out a figure crouched in front of the next room over. They appeared to be fiddling with the lock. I watched, barely breathing, as the figure straightened up and turned slightly. It was a woman, middle-aged, with a cleaning cart beside her. Just a housekeeper, I realized, with a mixture of relief and embarrassment. My paranoia was reaching new heights. Still, I waited until she had moved further down the hall before I dared to move the chair and open my door. The coast clear, I quickly made my way to the motel office to check out. I needed to get back on the road. As I handed over my room key, the clerk, a bored-looking teenager, barely glanced up from his phone. "Hope you enjoyed your stay, Mr. Fletcher." I froze. I hadn't given my real name when I checked in. The clerk seemed to sense my sudden tension. He looked up, brow furrowed. "Everything okay, sir?" I didn't give you my name," I managed to stammer out. Now the kid looked genuinely confused. "Yes, you did. It's right here on the registration card. Jason Fletcher, paid cash for one night." My mind reeled. Had I been so exhausted that I'd forgotten using my real name? Or was something more sinister at play? "Right, of course," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sorry, I'm still a bit groggy." I practically ran to my car, throwing my meager belongings into the back seat. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I caught sight of the housekeeper watching me from an upstairs window. Was that just innocent curiosity on her face, or something more? Back on the highway, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had I really used my real name? The lack of sleep, the constant stress. It was entirely possible I'd made a mistake. But a nagging doubt persisted. What if they had somehow gotten there first, set this all up? As miles of asphalt disappeared under my tires, my thoughts drifted back to where this all began. The forests of Oregon seemed a lifetime ago now, but the memory of those first unsettling encounters was still vivid. I remembered the day I'd first noticed something was off. It wasn't just the missing chair. There had been other, smaller things. A book I could have sworn I'd left in the RV turning up by the campfire. Unfamiliar boot prints in the mud near my campsite. At the time, I'd dismissed these as products of an overactive imagination. Now I wondered if they had been warning signs, breadcrumbs leading to the nightmare I now found myself living. Lost in these thoughts, I almost missed the sign indicating a rest stop ahead. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since those snacks from the gas station. Against my better judgment, I decided to stop. I needed fuel, both for the car and for myself. The rest stop was surprisingly busy for a weekday afternoon. Families on road trips, truckers taking mandated breaks, a group of college-age kids laughing around a picnic table. The normalcy of it all was almost shocking after weeks of isolation and fear. I kept my head down as I made my way to the vending machines, hyper-aware of everyone around me. As I fumbled for change, a voice behind me made me jump. "Excuse me, sir. I think you dropped this." I turned to see a young woman holding out a crumpled $5 bill. She smiled apologetically. "It fell out of your pocket when you walked by." "Oh, thanks," I mumbled, taking the money. Had it really fallen out of my pocket? I couldn't remember having any loose bills. The woman's smile faltered slightly at my brusque response. "No problem. Hey, are you okay? You seem a little—" "I'm fine," I cut her off, perhaps more sharply than I intended. "Thanks again." I hurried back to my car, the vending machine snacks forgotten. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I caught sight of the young woman in my rearview mirror. She was watching me leave, a phone pressed to her ear. Paranoia surged through me once again. Was she one of them? Had this all been a setup? I pressed down on the accelerator, eager to put as much distance between myself and the rest stop as possible. It was only once I was back on the open road, the rest stop long behind me, that a chilling thought occurred to me. The woman had said the money fell out when I walked by, but I hadn't walked past her. I'd gone straight to the vending machines. How had she seen me before our interaction? My knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as the implications sank in. They were everywhere. They were always watching, and they were getting closer. The realization that I was being watched, possibly followed, by an unseen network of people sent my mind spiraling. Every car on the road became a potential threat. Every glance from a passing driver felt loaded with sinister intent. The open road, once my escape, now felt like an elaborate trap closing in around me. As night fell, I found myself on a lonely stretch of highway cutting through dense forest. The trees pressed close to the road, their shadows dancing in my headlights. It reminded me too much of those woods in Oregon where this nightmare began. I needed to find somewhere to stop, to regroup and plan my next move. A battered sign announced, "Lou's Diner, next exit." Food and coffee sounded heavenly, and I reasoned that a public place might be safer than continuing to drive alone in the dark. I took the exit, the gravel crunching under my tires as I pulled into the small parking lot. Lou's Diner looked like it had been plucked straight out of the 1950s, all chrome and neon, with a jukebox visible through the window. A few trucks were parked out front, their drivers presumably inside grabbing a late dinner. The bell above the door jingled as I entered. A handful of patrons looked up briefly before returning to their meals. I slid into a booth near the back, positioning myself so I could see both the door and the parking lot through the window. A waitress approached, her name tag reading Darlene. She looked to be in her mid-60s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "What can I get for you, hun?" I ordered coffee and a burger, my stomach rumbling at the smell of food wafting from the kitchen. As Darlene walked away, I found myself studying the other diners more closely. There was a couple in their 30s, talking in hushed tones over plates of pie. An older man sat at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee and chatting with the cook. Two truckers occupied a booth near the door, their conversation punctuated by bursts of laughter. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had become my constant companion. I pulled out my phone, hesitating for a moment before opening the browser. I hadn't dared to look myself up online since this all began, afraid of what I might find or who might be able to track my searches. With shaking fingers, I typed in my name, Jason Fletcher. The results made my blood run cold. The top hit was a missing persons report, filed in Oregon just days after I'd fled the campsite. My photo stared back at me, alongside details of my last known whereabouts. The report had been filed by my former employer, stating that I had failed to return from vacation and that family and friends are concerned for his well-being. I scrolled further, finding social media posts from people I knew or thought I knew, expressing worry about my disappearance. There were news articles speculating about what might have happened to me, some even hinting at foul play. The world tilted sideways as the implications hit me. To everyone I knew, to the authorities, I wasn't running from something. I was a missing person, a victim. But a victim of what? And if I wasn't the one behind my own disappearance, then who was? Here you go, sweetie. Darlene's voice jolted me back to reality as she set down my burger and refilled my coffee cup. She paused, concern etching her features. You all right there? You look like you've seen a ghost. I forced a weak smile. Just tired. Long drive. She nodded sympathetically. Well, you eat up and get some rest. It's not safe to drive when you're exhausted. As she walked away, my gaze fell on a missing poster tacked to the diner's bulletin board. It wasn't me, just a local teenager who had apparently run away from home, but it sent a chill down my spine nonetheless. I ate quickly, keeping one eye on the door and the other on my fellow diners. The couple left hand in hand. One of the truckers headed to the restroom. The man at the counter ordered another coffee. Just as I was finishing my meal, the bell above the door jingled again. A man entered, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a cowboy hat that shadowed his face. My heart leapt into my throat. It was him, the man from the gas station, the one who had watched me drive away. He scanned the diner slowly before making his way to the counter. I slouched down in my booth, praying he hadn't noticed me. Darlene approached him with a smile. Evening, Sheriff. The usual? Sheriff. The word echoed in my head. This man wasn't just some random pursuer, he was law enforcement. The missing persons report flashed through my mind. Was he looking for me as a victim or as a suspect? I had to get out of here, now. I left some crumpled bills on the table and slid out of the booth, keeping my head down. My heart pounded in my ears as I made my way to the door, painfully aware of the sheriff's presence just a few feet away. The bell above the door had barely finished jingling when I heard a voice behind me. Excuse me, sir? I froze, one hand on the door. Slowly, I turned to face the sheriff, who was now standing, his eyes fixed on me. You wouldn't happen to be Jason Fletcher, would you? He asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. For a moment, I considered making a run for it, but something in the sheriff's demeanor made me hesitate. He didn't look threatening. If anything, he looked concerned. Yes, that's me, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The sheriff nodded, relief evident on his face. I'm Sheriff Tom Hawkins. A lot of people have been worried about you, son. Why don't we sit down and talk? The next few hours were a blur. Sheriff Hawkins listened patiently as I poured out my story. The strange occurrences in Oregon, the feeling of being watched, the chase across the country. To my surprise, he didn't dismiss my fears or treat me like I was crazy. I've seen some strange things in my time, he said, refilling my coffee cup. And I've learned not to discount a man's instincts. But let's look at this logically. You say you felt watched in Oregon. When exactly did that start? I thought back, trying to pinpoint the first moment of unease. It was after I posted some photos of my campsite on social media. I remember because a lot of people commented on how beautiful and secluded it looked. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. And you gave the exact location? I guess I did, I admitted, feeling foolish. I was trying to build a following for my travel blog. Sheriff Hawkins nodded thoughtfully. That might explain how they found you initially. But the rest of it, the missing chair, the figure by the fire, that's not just internet stalkers. He pulled out a small notebook and began jotting things down. Have you ever heard of the Sentinel Syndicate? I shook my head, confused by the sudden change in topic. They're a group that's been on our radar for a while now, the sheriff explained. They target solo travelers, people who won't be missed right away. Their MO is psychological manipulation, making their victims think they're going crazy before moving in. A chill ran down my spine. But why? What do they want? That's the million-dollar question, Sheriff Hawkins sighed. From what we've pieced together, it's some kind of sick game to them. They get off on the power, on watching their victims unravel. The pieces started falling into place. The subtle manipulations, the constant feeling of being watched. But one thing still didn't make sense. If they're so secretive, how do you know about them? I asked. The sheriff's expression darkened. Because my daughter was one of their victims. She disappeared on a solo camping trip 3 years ago. We found her 6 months later, but she was never the same. The things they did to her mind. He trailed off, lost in painful memories. When he spoke again, his voice was filled with determination. That's why I've made it my mission to stop them. And you, Jason, might be the key to finally bringing them down. Over the next few days, I worked closely with Sheriff Hawkins and a small team of trusted officers. We pored over my travel logs, identifying potential syndicate members and safe houses. The sheriff's theory was that they had been hurting me, subtly manipulating my route to lead me to a specific location. They like to play with their food before they eat it, he explained grimly. But that's going to be their downfall. We're going to use their own game against them. The plan was risky. I would continue my journey, appearing to be still running scared. But this time I would be wired, every interaction recorded. We identified a likely target, an isolated cabin rental in the mountains of Colorado, the kind of place a paranoid fugitive might hole up. As I prepared to leave, Sheriff Hawkins pulled me aside. "You sure you're up for this, son? No one would blame you for walking away now." I thought about all the miles I'd driven in fear, all the nights I'd lain awake wondering if I was losing my mind. I thought about the sheriff's daughter and all the other victims who hadn't been as lucky as me. "I'm sure," I said firmly. "Let's end this." The drive to Colorado was tense. Every car that stayed behind me too long, every friendly wave from a passing driver sent my heart racing. But this time the fear was tinged with purpose. I arrived at the cabin as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pine-covered landscape. It was beautiful in a lonely sort of way. As I unpacked my meager belongings, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. "That's the point, asterisk," I reminded myself. Asterisk. Let them think they've won, asterisk. Days passed. I made a show of fortifying the cabin, setting up makeshift alarms, always looking over my shoulder. All the while, the hidden cameras Sheriff Hawkins had provided recorded everything. It was on the fourth night that they finally made their move. I was awoken by a soft scratching at the door. Heart pounding, I reached for the panic button disguised as a keychain. In the dim moonlight filtering through the windows, I saw the doorknob slowly turn. 3 figures entered, 2 men and a woman, all dressed in nondescript dark clothing. They moved with an eerie silence, spreading out to surround my bed. "Hello, Jason," the woman said softly. "We've been waiting a long time for this moment." I sat up slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The woman's laugh was cold, devoid of any real mirth. "Want? Oh, Jason, we don't want anything from you. You're simply a player in our game, and you've performed admirably." One of the men stepped forward, a strange device in his hand. "Now it's time for the final act. Don't worry, this won't hurt much." As he reached for me, all hell broke loose. The cabin was suddenly flooded with light as Sheriff Hawkins and his team burst in from their hiding places. The syndicate members were caught completely off guard, taken down before they could even reach for their weapons. In the chaos that followed, the reading of rights, the cataloging of evidence found in the cabin, I sat on the porch, wrapped in a shock blanket. It was over. They were caught. So why didn't I feel relieved? Sheriff Hawkins joined me, handing me a steaming cup of coffee. "You did good, son. Real good. We've got enough to put these 3 away for a long time, and the evidence in there will help us track down more of their operation." I nodded, unable to find words. The sheriff seemed to understand. "It's going to take time," he said gently, "to feel safe again, to trust. But you're not alone. We've got resources, support groups for survivors, and my door is always open." As the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't running anymore. 1 year later. The open road stretches before me, a ribbon of possibility under an endless sky. Gertrude II, my new RV, hums contentedly as we eat up the miles. It hasn't been an easy journey. There were nights when the darkness felt suffocating, days when every stranger's glance seemed to hide malicious intent. But slowly, with help, I've reclaimed my life. The Sentinel Syndicate investigation is ongoing. The 3 captured at the cabin were just the tip of the iceberg, but their arrests led to more, a domino effect that's still playing out. I check in with Sheriff Hawkins, Tom, as he insists I call him now, regularly, both to stay updated on the case and because he's become something of a father figure to me. I still travel, still share my adventures online, but now I'm more careful, more aware, and I'm not alone anymore. Through a support group for syndicate survivors, I met Elena, another solo traveler whose life was upended by their sick game. We connected over shared experiences, shared healing. Now we share the road. As we pull into a campsite for the night, I can't help but smile at the familiar routine, setting up chairs, building a fire. Elena catches my eye and grins. "Race you to the lake?" Later, as we sit by the fire, I think about how far I've come. The fear isn't gone completely. I don't think it ever will be. But it no longer controls me. I reach for my phone, hesitating for just a moment before opening my travel blog. My fingers fly over the keyboard as I begin a new post. The thing about the open road is that it's full of possibilities, both good and bad. But that's life, isn't it? We can't let fear of the bad stop us from experiencing the good. So here's to the journey, to the unknown around the next bend. Here's to living, not just surviving. I hit post and set my phone aside, turning my gaze to the star-filled sky above. Tomorrow we'll hit the road again, another adventure waiting. But for now, in this moment, I am exactly where I need to be, too. You know, life has a funny way of reminding you that you're not in control as much as you'd like to think. Just when I thought I had things all figured out, it decided to throw me a curveball. I remember it vividly, that day when everything changed. It was supposed to be a relaxing RV camping trip to get away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Little did I know it would become a fight for survival. I've always enjoyed the solitude of nature, the peace and quiet that comes with being far from the city's noise. My RV was parked at a secluded spot in Blackwood National Forest, nestled deep in the heart of Montana. This place was perfect. Dense trees, a crystal-clear stream nearby, and not a soul in sight. I was looking forward to a week of fishing, hiking, and maybe a bit of reading by the campfire. My name is Alex Morgan, and I'm a 35-year-old software developer from Seattle. After a particularly stressful project at work, I decided to take some time off and reconnect with nature. I'd always been an outdoors enthusiast, but the demands of my career had kept me chained to my desk for far too long. This trip was meant to be my reset button, a chance to clear my head and recharge my batteries. As I set up camp on that first day, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement mixed with trepidation. The forest around me was alive with the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and earth. It was a stark contrast to the sterile environment of my office, and I found myself taking deep breaths, savoring the change. I spent the first couple of days settling into a rhythm. I'd wake up early, brew a pot of coffee on my portable stove, and watch the mist rise from the nearby stream as the sun peeked through the trees. Then I'd grab my fishing rod and try my luck in the clear waters, more often than not managing to catch something for dinner. In the afternoons, I'd explore the surrounding forest, taking care to mark my trail so I wouldn't get lost. The trees here were ancient, their gnarled trunks and sprawling canopies creating a cathedral-like atmosphere. I found myself speaking in hushed tones as if afraid to disturb the sanctity of this place. As night fell, I'd return to my campsite, build a fire, and lose myself in the pages of a book I'd brought along, a collection of horror stories by H.P. Lovecraft. In retrospect, perhaps not the best choice for a solo camping trip in the wilderness, but I've always enjoyed a good scare. Little did I know that real horror was lurking just beyond the flickering light of my campfire. It was on the third day that things took a turn for the strange. I had spent the morning fishing and was making my way back to camp when I noticed something odd. A metallic glint caught my eye, coming from the underbrush across the stream. Curiosity piqued. I carefully made my way across the water, my boots slipping on the moss-covered rocks. Pushing through the dense foliage, I came upon an old rusted metal box, half buried in the dirt. It looked like it had been there for years, the metal corroded and covered in a thick layer of grime. I pulled it out, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. What could be inside? Lost treasure, old mementos, or something more sinister? Using a rock, I managed to pry open the box. Inside, I found a collection of items that seemed to belong to another time. There were faded photographs, yellowed with age, showing a young couple. They were smiling and happy, clearly in love. The man had a rugged, outdoorsy look about him, with a thick beard and piercing eyes. The woman was beautiful, with long dark hair and a carefree smile that seemed to light up the frame. Along with the photos, there were a few letters. The paper was fragile, and the ink had faded, making them difficult to read. But from what I could make out, they were love letters, filled with passionate declarations and promises of eternal devotion. The handwriting was elegant, speaking of a time when penmanship was valued and taught with care. But it was the small, leather-bound notebook that really caught my attention. The cover was worn and cracked, but the pages inside were still intact. As I flipped through it, I realized it was a journal, filled with handwritten entries detailing the couple's adventures in this very forest. The entries started off innocently enough, describing hikes and camping trips, wildlife sightings, and quiet moments by the campfire. But as I read on, the tone began to change. The writer, who I assumed was the man from the photographs, began to describe strange occurrences. One entry, dated June 17, 1978, stood out. Asterisk, June 17, 1978. Something's not right in these woods. For the past few nights, Emily and I have been hearing strange noises after dark. At first, we thought it was just animals, but it's different. There's a rhythm to it, almost like footsteps, but not quite. And the feeling of being watched is constant now. Emily's scared, though she tries not to show it. I told her it's nothing, but I'm not so sure anymore. Asterisk. Last night I saw something, a figure just at the edge of our campsite. It was too dark to make out clearly, but it was tall, unnaturally so. When I shined my flashlight in that direction, it was gone. I didn't tell Emily. No need to frighten her more. We're leaving tomorrow. I love these woods, but something tells me we're not welcome here anymore. Asterisk. The entry ended there, and as I turned the page, expecting to find more, I was met with blank pages. The journal entries stopped abruptly, leaving me with more questions than answers. A chill ran down my spine as I read those words. The sun, which had been high in the sky when I found the box, was now dipping towards the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful just hours ago, now felt oppressive and watchful. I shook my head, trying to dispel the unease that had settled over me. It was just an old story, probably embellished for effect. People loved to tell tales about spooky encounters in the woods. It didn't mean anything. Still, as I made my way back to my campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The birds, which had been singing all day, were now eerily silent. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that sounded almost like whispers. By the time I got back to my RV, darkness had fallen. I quickly built a fire, its warm light providing a small circle of comfort in the growing gloom. As I sat down to cook the fish I'd caught earlier, I found my eyes constantly darting to the tree line, searching for what? A tall figure? A pair of watching eyes? I laughed nervously at myself. "Get a grip, Alex," I muttered. "It's just a story. You're letting your imagination run wild." But as the night deepened, the forest around me seemed to come alive with sounds. Crickets chirped, an owl hooted in the distance, and small animals rustled in the underbrush. Normal nighttime sounds, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. Yet there was something else. A subtle but persistent feeling of being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself growing tenser by the minute. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the perimeter of my camp, its beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I tried to relax, focusing on my dinner and the warmth of the fire, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch, a presence just beyond the reach of my senses. That's when I heard it, a branch snapping close by, too close. I froze, flashlight in hand, and slowly turned towards the sound. The beam of light revealed nothing but trees and shadows, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. No response came, just the quiet crackle of my campfire and the distant hoot of an owl. I sat back down, more alert now, my eyes constantly scanning the darkness beyond my little circle of light. Minutes felt like hours as I strained my ears for any unusual sound. Just when I started to relax, convinced I was letting the journal's story get to me, I heard it again. Another snap, even closer this time. I stood up, this time with my hunting knife in hand, and shined the light into the darkness. Still nothing. But the forest was different now. The air felt thick, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Then I saw it, a flicker of movement just beyond the reach of the light. I aimed the beam in that direction and caught a glimpse of something slipping behind a tree. My pulse quickened. This was no animal. The movement was too deliberate, too human. I kept the light trained on the spot and called out again, louder this time. "Show yourself." Silence answered me, but the tension in the air grew thicker. I backed up towards my RV, never taking my eyes off the tree line. Another movement caught my attention, this time to my left. I swung the light around, and there, partially hidden by the shadows, stood a man. He was tall, unnaturally so, just like the figure described in the journal. His build was lean, almost emaciated, and he wore tattered clothes that looked like they'd been through hell. But it was his face that sent a jolt of terror through me. Gaunt and pale, with sunken cheeks and wild, feverish eyes, he looked more like a corpse than a living man. Those eyes, glinting in the flashlight's beam, held a mixture of madness and malevolence that made my blood run cold. "Who are you?" I demanded, knife at the ready, though I doubted it would be much use if he decided to attack. He stepped forward, just enough for me to see him more clearly. A sinister smile spread across his face, revealing teeth that were yellow and rotting. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a low, gravelly voice that seemed to echo in the quiet forest. "This is public land," I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I have every right to be here. Now who are you and what do you want?" His smile widened, and I saw something dark and sticky on his teeth. I prayed it was just poor dental hygiene, but a voice in the back of my mind whispered otherwise. "You found the box, didn't you?" he asked, taking another step closer. I hesitated, but there was no point in denying it. "Yes, what of it?" "You should have left it buried," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "Now you're involved." "Involved in what?" I asked, my grip tightening on the knife. "In what happened to them," he replied, gesturing vaguely towards the forest. "In what's been happening here for decades." I didn't wait to hear more. I bolted for the RV, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. My heart was racing, and I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. I grabbed my phone, cursing when I saw there was no signal. With shaking hands, I grabbed my keys and started the engine, ready to get the hell out of there. But as the headlights cut through the darkness, I saw him again, standing in front of the RV, blocking my path. His expression was one of cold determination, and I knew with certainty that he had no intention of letting me leave. I honked the horn, a long, angry blast that echoed through the forest. He didn't budge. Desperation clawed at me as I realized I was trapped. The RV suddenly felt claustrophobic, and I knew I couldn't stay here. Making a split-second decision, I floored the gas pedal. The RV lurched forward, and at the last second the man moved, avoiding the impact. But I didn't stop to see where he went. I drove down the narrow, winding road as fast as I dared, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. The forest around me seemed to close in, the trees leaning in like silent witnesses to my terror. I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see him chasing after me, moving with that unnatural speed that only exists in nightmares. Finally, I reached a small clearing where the road widened enough for me to turn around. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, and decided to head back to the main highway, leaving the campsite and all my gear behind. I didn't care about any of it anymore. All I wanted was to get out of those woods and back to civilization. The man's words echoed in my mind. "You're involved." I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right, that I'd stumbled into something far bigger and more terrifying than a simple camping trip gone wrong. The headlights picked up a sign pointing towards the highway, and I felt a surge of relief. Just a few more miles, and I'd be out of this nightmare. But life, as I mentioned earlier, has a way of reminding you that you're not in control. Just as I thought I was safe, something heavy slammed into the side of the RV. The impact was so sudden and violent that I lost control of the vehicle. It skidded off the road, tires screeching against the asphalt. I fought to regain control, but it was useless. The RV tipped and crashed into a ditch with a sickening crunch of metal and breaking glass. The world spun around me, a kaleidoscope of darkness and pain. Then everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of the RV, dazed and disoriented. Pain shot through my body and I could taste blood in my mouth. The interior of the RV was a mess, with broken glass and scattered belongings everywhere. I tried to move to assess the damage, but my body protested. Every inch of me ached, and I was pretty sure I had at least a few broken ribs. The metallic tang of blood filled my nostrils, mixed with the acrid smell of leaking gasoline. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching the RV. My heart, which had been pounding, seemed to stop altogether. I knew who it was before I saw him. The door, which had been dented inward from the crash, was suddenly ripped open with inhuman strength, and there he stood, silhouetted against the night sky, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "You shouldn't have run," he snarled, reaching in and dragging me out into the cold night air. I tried to fight back, to resist, but my limbs felt like lead. He threw me to the ground, and I landed hard, the impact driving what little air I had left from my lungs. "You should have left well enough alone," he continued, looming over me. "But now you're part of it, just like they were." I struggled to my feet, my vision blurry and my mind reeling. "What do you want from me?" I gasped, tasting blood with every word. His lips curled into that twisted smile again. "Justice," he replied. "For them, for all of them." He pulled out a knife, its blade glinting in the moonlight. It looked old, possibly as old as the box I'd found in the woods. I knew then that this was it. If I didn't act now, I'd end up like the couple from the photos, another victim of whatever madness plagued these woods. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I lunged at him. The move caught him off guard, and we grappled, the knife between us. My survival instincts kicked in, overriding the pain and fear. In that moment, nothing mattered except getting that knife. We struggled, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. He was strong, unnaturally so, but desperation lent me strength I didn't know I possessed. Somehow, miraculously, I managed to wrench the knife from his grip. Without thinking, driven purely by the instinct to survive, I drove the blade into his side. He let out a strangled cry, more of surprise than pain, and staggered back. Blood, dark and viscous, oozed between his fingers as he clutched the wound. He sank to his knees, those wild eyes now filled with a mixture of pain and... was that relief? For a moment we stared at each other, both of us panting heavily. Then, to my utter shock, he began to laugh. It was a terrible sound, a wheezing, broken noise that sent chills down my spine. "You don't understand," he gasped between bursts of laughter. "This changes nothing. You're still part of it now. They'll come for you, just like they came for me." I didn't wait to hear more. Clutching my injured ribs, I stumbled back to the RV. By some miracle, the engine sputtered to life when I turned the key. I threw it into reverse, wincing at the screech of metal as the vehicle pulled itself free from the ditch. As I drove away, I could still hear his laughter echoing through the trees. I kept expecting him to appear in my rearview mirror, but he never did. The winding forest road seemed endless, each turn revealing more darkness, more trees that all looked the same in the dim headlights. It felt like hours before I finally saw the lights of civilization. The small town of Millbrook appeared like an oasis in the desert. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, my hands shaking so badly I could barely put the RV in park. The attendant, a middle-aged man with a kind face, took one look at me and called the police. Within minutes, the quiet gas station was a flurry of activity. Police cars, an ambulance, curious onlookers. It was all a blur. I told my story to the police, watching their expressions change from skepticism to concern. They took my statement and immediately sent units to investigate the forest and the crash site. The paramedics patched me up, confirming my suspicions about the broken ribs and adding a concussion to the list of injuries. The next few days passed in a haze of hospital rooms, police interviews, and sleepless nights. They found the crash site, my abandoned campsite, even the old metal box with its contents. But of the strange man, there was no sign. No body, no blood trail, nothing to corroborate my story except the knife wound in my side that the doctors said was defensive. The case was eventually classified as self-defense against an unknown assailant, likely a drifter or escaped mental patient, they said. I was free to go, to return to my life in Seattle. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. In the months that followed, I tried to put the incident behind me. I returned to work, to my comfortable apartment, to the rhythms of city life. But the forest never truly left me. I'd wake up in cold sweats, the man's laughter ringing in my ears. I'd see tall, gaunt figures out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. And then the dreams started. Vivid, terrifying dreams of running through endless woods, of voices whispering from the shadows, of hands reaching out to grab me. In these dreams, I'd often find myself back at that campsite, staring at the old metal box. But when I opened it, instead of photos and letters, I'd find only darkness. A darkness that seemed to go on forever, threatening to swallow me whole. I've thought a lot about that trip, about the man and his obsession with the past, about the couple in the photos and what might have happened to them. Maybe he was right. Maybe I should have left the box buried, should have never set foot in those woods. But curiosity is a powerful force, and sometimes it leads us down paths we can never truly leave. I haven't been back to Blackwood National Forest since that night. Maybe one day I will, to face whatever is waiting for me there. But not today. Not yet. For now, I'm content with the memories of a peaceful camping trip that turned into a fight for my life. I've taken up writing, putting my experiences down on paper in an attempt to make sense of them. It helps sometimes. Other times it feels like I'm just inviting the darkness in. As I sit here typing these words, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that somewhere in the shadows just beyond my perception, something is waiting for me to let my guard down, to forget what happened in those woods. But I won't forget. I can't. Because deep down, I know the truth that I've been trying to deny all these months. The man in the forest was right. I'm involved now. And whatever dwells in the shadows of Blackwood Forest isn't finished with me yet. Sometimes late at night when the city sleeps and the world grows quiet, I swear I can hear it, a faint whisper carried on the wind, calling me back to the woods. And in those moments I wonder not if, but when I'll answer that call, because the forest is patient, and now so am I. I remember the first day I realized how different my life was, not because of some grand adventure, but because of the small, significant moments that piled up to define my existence. It was a Tuesday, and I had just set out on my much-anticipated RV camping trip. I loved the freedom it gave me, a break from the monotony of everyday life. My name is Lucas Blackwood, and I'm known among my friends for my love of the outdoors, though I faced more than my fair share of hardships. I decided to camp near the banks of the Shenandoah River, a serene spot known for its picturesque views and tranquil environment. The late spring air was crisp, filled with the scents of blooming flowers and freshly cut grass. My RV was parked in a small clearing surrounded by tall oaks, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. By noon, I had set up my campsite and was enjoying a simple lunch. The world seemed at peace, and so was I. I spent the afternoon fishing, catching a couple of sizable trout which I planned to grill for dinner. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, I settled by the fire with a book in hand. It was around this time that I noticed a figure in the distance. At first, it was just a shadow moving among the trees, but as it drew closer, I saw it was a man, perhaps in his mid-30s, with a rugged look and an intense expression. He approached my campsite cautiously, his eyes scanning the area as if looking for something or someone. "Evening," I called out, trying to sound friendly. "Beautiful spot, isn't it?" He nodded, but didn't respond. His silence was unnerving. He wore a worn-out jacket and heavy boots, which suggested he had been traveling through the woods for some time. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "I'm looking for my brother," he finally said, his voice rough. "We got separated a couple of days ago." "I haven't seen anyone else around here," I replied. "You sure he's in this area?" He nodded again. "Yeah, he's around here somewhere. Name's Daniel. If you see him, let him know Owen's looking for him." I agreed to keep an eye out and offered him some food and water, which he declined before disappearing back into the woods. His visit left me uneasy, but I shrugged it off. People got lost in the woods all the time. It wasn't unusual for them to ask for help. As night fell, I retreated into my RV, locking the doors behind me. I was ready for a good night's sleep after the long day, but sleep wouldn't come easily. I kept hearing noises, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, though I told myself it was just the wildlife. Around midnight, I heard a distinct knock on my RV door. My heart pounded as I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously approached the door. "Who's there?" "It's me, Owen. I think I found him." I opened the door slightly, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Owen's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "What's wrong?" "Come with me, you need to see this." I grabbed my jacket and followed him into the woods. We walked in silence, the only sound being the crunch of leaves under our boots. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a small clearing. Owen pointed to the ground and my blood ran cold. There, lying face down in the dirt, was a body. I knelt down, my hands trembling as I checked for a pulse. There was none. The man was dead, his face battered and unrecognizable. "Daniel?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Owen nodded. "What happened to him?" "I don't know. I found him like this," he replied, his voice breaking. "We need to call the authorities." We made our way back to my RV and I dialed 911 with shaking hands. The dispatcher's calm voice was a stark contrast to the panic I felt. I gave them our location and explained the situation. They assured me that help was on the way. As we waited, Owen and I sat in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on us. The minutes felt like hours. Finally, we saw the flashing lights of the police cars approaching. The officers took our statements and secured the scene, treating it as a potential crime. The rest of the night was a blur of questions and flashing cameras. I felt like I was living someone else's nightmare. By dawn, they had identified the body as Daniel, confirming Owen's worst fears. The police suspected foul play and began their investigation in earnest. Owen was taken in for further questioning and I was allowed to stay at a nearby motel, my RV now part of a crime scene. The sense of peace I had felt just 24 hours earlier was shattered, replaced by an uneasy feeling that this was far from over. In the following days, the investigation unfolded like a twisted puzzle. It turned out that Owen and Daniel had been involved in some illegal activities, something I had not expected. They were part of a smuggling ring, using the dense woods and secluded campsites as their routes. Daniel's death was likely a message from their associates, a warning to Owen. I kept my distance from the investigation, but the details trickled in through the news and occasional visits from the detectives. I learned that the smuggling ring was more extensive than anyone had realized, involving not just drugs but also weapons and other illicit goods. The authorities were cracking down hard, using Daniel's murder as leverage to dismantle the operation. One evening, about a week after the incident, I was packing up my things to head home when I received an unexpected visitor. Detective Harris, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a steely demeanor, knocked on my motel room door. "Mr. Blackwood, we need to talk," she said, flashing her badge. "Of course, Detective. What's this about?" "We have reason to believe that you might be in danger," she said, her tone grave. "Owen has been cooperating with us, and his associates might not take kindly to that. They might see you as a loose end." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you suggest I do?" "We're offering you protection, but we also need your help. We believe Owen's brother's murder is just the tip of the iceberg. If you're willing to assist us, we can ensure your safety." It was a lot to take in. I had come here for a peaceful camping trip and now found myself entangled in a criminal investigation, but there was no other choice. I agreed to cooperate, knowing it was the only way to stay safe and perhaps make a difference. Over the next few weeks, I worked closely with Detective Harris and her team. They used me as bait, setting up another camping trip to lure the smugglers out. The operation was risky, but it was our best shot at catching them in the act. I found myself back in the woods, this time with a team of undercover officers nearby. The tension was palpable as we waited for the smugglers to take the bait. Hours passed with no sign of them, and I began to wonder if they had seen through our plan. Just as I was about to call it a night, I heard the familiar rustling of leaves. My heart raced as I signaled to the officers, who moved silently into position. A group of men emerged from the trees, their faces hard and eyes filled with malice. They were heavily armed, and it was clear they meant business. "Where's Owen?" one of them demanded. "He's not here," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Wrong answer," the leader snarled, raising his weapon. Before he could pull the trigger, the woods exploded with activity. The undercover officers sprang into action, taking the smugglers by surprise. Gunfire echoed through the trees, and I ducked for cover behind a fallen log. The firefight was intense, but the officers had the upper hand thanks to their preparation and numbers. When the dust settled, the smugglers were subdued, and the officers quickly secured the area. I emerged from my hiding spot, shaken but unharmed. Detective Harris approached me, a look of relief on her face. "You did well, Lucas. We got them," she said, patting my shoulder. The operation was a success. The smugglers were arrested and their operation dismantled. Owen, in exchange for his cooperation, entered witness protection, hoping to start a new life far from the shadows of his past. As for me, I returned to my RV, the peaceful campsite now a stark reminder of the chaos that had unfolded. I packed up my things, ready to leave the woods behind. The tranquility I once sought here was forever tainted by the memories of that night. But life goes on. I resumed my routine, though with a newfound appreciation for the ordinary moments. The experience had changed me, but not in the way one might expect. I wasn't haunted by nightmares or overwhelmed by fear. Instead, I felt a sense of resilience, a determination to live fully despite the darkness I had witnessed. As I drove away from the Shenandoah River, I glanced in the rearview mirror, the tall oaks receding into the distance. The woods held many secrets, some of which I had uncovered. And while I couldn't forget what happened, I refused to let it define me. Yet, as the miles rolled by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. In the shadows of the trees lining the road, I swore I saw figures moving, keeping pace with my RV. And in the quiet moments when the engine's hum faded into the background, I could hear whispers carried on the wind, speaking of unfinished business and debts yet to be paid. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. The horror I thought I'd left behind in those woods was far from over. It had merely changed form, becoming a shadow that clung to me, a presence that waited in the corners of my vision, biding its time. As night fell and the road stretched endlessly before me, I realized that my journey into darkness had only just begun. The woods may have held secrets, but the real terror was what I had brought out with me. A knowledge that there were things in this world far more sinister than I had ever imagined, and they now knew my name. The horror story of my life wasn't ending. It was evolving, growing, spreading its tendrils into every aspect of my existence. And as I drove on into the night, I couldn't help but wonder, when would the next chapter begin, and what nightmares would it bring? I never thought I'd be the one to tell this story. Hell, I never thought I'd live to tell it. But here I am, Ethan Blackwood, former city dweller and adventure seeker, now a shell of the man I once was. It's been 3 years since that fateful trip to Shadow Lake, and not a day goes by that I don't relive the horrors I experienced in those godforsaken woods. It all started innocently enough. I was burnt out from my high-stress job as a software engineer in Boston. My relationship had just ended messily, and I was desperate for an escape. That's when I remembered the old RV my uncle had left me, a clunky 1985 Winnebago that had seen better days. On a whim, I decided to take a month-long sabbatical and drive up to the remote wilderness of northern Maine. I'd always been drawn to solitude, having grown up in rural Vermont where our nearest neighbor was miles away. Little did I know that this solitude would become my worst nightmare. I set out on a crisp September morning, the air tinged with the first hints of autumn. The drive was long but therapeutic, watching the bustling cities give way to rolling countryside, and finally to the dense, primeval forests of Maine. By the time I reached the outskirts of Shadow Lake, it was late afternoon, and the sun was already dipping behind the towering pines, casting long shadows across the narrow, winding road. Shadow Lake wasn't on any tourist maps, I'd heard about it from a colleague who swore it was the most peaceful place he'd ever visited. "If you want to get away from it all, that's where you go," he'd said. Now, as I navigated the RV down the overgrown dirt road leading to the lake, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. The forest seemed to press in on all sides, the trees unnaturally still in the fading light. I finally reached a small clearing by the lakeshore and parked the RV. The lake stretched out before me, a vast mirror reflecting the darkening sky. The water was so still it looked like black glass. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of pine and damp earth. This was what I needed: peace, quiet, and solitude. That first night passed uneventfully. I set up a small campfire, grilled some hot dogs, and sat watching the stars come out one by one. The night was silent except for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of some small animal in the underbrush. I felt the tension of the past few months start to melt away. The next morning I woke early, eager to explore my surroundings. I made a quick breakfast of instant coffee and granola bars, then set out with my backpack and camera. The forest around Shadow Lake was old, the kind of ancient woodland that makes you feel small and insignificant. Massive pines towered overhead, their branches blocking out much of the sky. The forest floor was a thick carpet of pine needles and moss, punctuated by granite boulders left behind by long-ago glaciers. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest was too quiet. There were no bird calls, no chattering squirrels, none of the usual sounds you'd expect in the woods. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself it was just my city-trained ears not used to real silence. It was around midday when I stumbled upon the first sign that something was truly wrong. In a small clearing, I found a campsite, or what was left of one. A tent lay in shreds, its contents strewn about as if a bear had rummaged through it. But there were no claw marks, no signs of animal activity. It looked more like someone had taken a knife and methodically sliced the tent to ribbons. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. "Hello," I called out. "Is anyone here?" No response. As I got closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were drag marks in the dirt, leading away from the tent and into the dense underbrush. And those marks, they looked disturbingly like someone had been pulled away against their will. I should have left right then, should have run back to my RV and driven away as fast as I could. But curiosity, that damned human trait that's both our greatest strength and our fatal flaw, got the better of me. I decided to follow the drag marks, just for a little while, to see if I could figure out what had happened. The trail led me deeper into the forest, to areas where the trees grew so close together that I had to squeeze between them. The light grew dimmer, filtered through layers of leaves and needles. And then I heard it, a sound that still haunts my nightmares. It was a whisper, so faint at first that I thought I was imagining it. But as I pressed on, it grew louder. Not one whisper, but many, overlapping and intertwining. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I couldn't make out words, just a sibilant hissing that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Panic started to set in. I turned to go back the way I'd come, but in my fear and confusion, I'd lost track of the path. Every direction looked the same, just endless trees and shadows. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be all around me now, pressing in like a physical force. I started to run, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. I had no idea where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from those terrible whispers. But no matter how fast I ran, they seemed to keep pace, always just behind me, always just out of sight. As I ran, the forest seemed to change. The trees looked wrong. Their bark was darker, almost black, and seemed to pulse with an inner light. The branches reached out like grasping fingers, trying to snag my clothes and hair. And the ground began to feel soft and yielding, like I was running across a gigantic sponge. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that nightmarish forest. Finally, my foot caught on a root and I went down hard, the breath knocked out of me. As I lay there, gasping for air, the whispers surrounded me, growing louder and more distinct. "Join us," they seemed to say. "Become one with the forest. Give yourself to the shadows." I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting around wildly, and that's when I saw them. Shapes moving in the shadows between the trees. They were vaguely humanoid, but wrong in ways I can't fully describe. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. And their faces, where there should have been faces, there were only swirling patterns of darkness. One of the creatures stepped forward, its movements fluid and unnatural. It reached out a long, spindly arm towards me, fingers elongating like tendrils of smoke. I felt a scream building in my throat, but before I could release it, everything went black. I woke up back in my RV, drenched in sweat and shaking uncontrollably. Sunlight was streaming through the windows, and for a moment I thought it had all been a terrible nightmare. But then I noticed the scratches on my arms, the tears in my clothes, and the pine needles in my hair. It had been real. All of it. I started the RV with shaking hands and peeled out of that clearing like the hounds of hell were after me. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those shadowy figures emerging from the trees. But there was nothing, just the road and the endless forest. It's been 3 years since that day, and I've never gone back to Shadow Lake. I've tried to convince myself that what I experienced was some kind of hallucination, maybe brought on by stress or some toxic plant I accidentally ingested. But deep down, I know the truth. There's something in those woods, something ancient and malevolent, something that whispers in the shadows and preys on the unwary. And sometimes, late at night when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear those whispers, calling me back to Shadow Lake. If you're reading this, consider it a warning. Stay away from Shadow Lake. Don't let curiosity get the better of you like it did me. Because if you go there, if you hear those whispers, you might not be as lucky as I was. You might never come back at all. For months after my escape from Shadow Lake, I tried to convince myself it had all been a stress-induced hallucination. I threw myself back into my work, took up meditation, even saw a therapist. But the nightmares persisted. Every night I found myself back in those dark woods, pursued by whispers and shadowy figures. It wasn't just the nightmares. Strange things began happening in my waking life too. I'd catch glimpses of impossibly tall, thin figures out of the corner of my eye, only to have them vanish when I turned to look. The shadows in my apartment seemed deeper, more alive somehow. And always, there was the faint sound of whispering just at the edge of hearing. I knew I was losing my grip on reality. I had to know the truth, had to prove to myself one way or another that what I'd experienced was real. So against every instinct screaming at me to run and never look back, I decided to return to Shadow Lake. This time I went prepared. I bought a high-end GPS device, a satellite phone, and enough supplies to last a week. I also brought a handgun. Not that I thought it would do much good against whatever was out there, but it made me feel a little safer. As I drove back up to Maine, a sense of dread settled over me like a heavy blanket. The closer I got to Shadow Lake, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The sky seemed to darken, the air grew thick and heavy, and that eerie silence I remembered from before descended once again. I arrived at the lake just before sunset. Everything looked exactly as I remembered it. The glassy surface of the water, the dense forest pressing in on all sides. I parked the RV in the same spot as before and set about securing the perimeter with motion sensor cameras and floodlights. That first night, nothing happened. I sat up until dawn, jumping at every creak and rustle, but the woods remained still and silent. As the sun rose, I began to wonder if I had imagined it all after all. Emboldened by the uneventful night, I decided to venture into the forest. I wanted to find that torn-up campsite to prove to myself that it had been real. I set out, GPS in hand, carefully marking my trail. Hours passed as I hiked deeper into the woods. The trees seemed to grow taller, their trunks wider and more gnarled. The canopy overhead became so thick that it was like twilight on the forest floor, even though my watch told me it was midday. And then I found it, the clearing with the shredded tent. It was exactly as I remembered, down to the drag marks leading into the underbrush. My heart pounded as I realized that it hadn't been a hallucination. It was all real. That's when I heard the whispers. They started soft, just like before, a susurration that could have been the wind in the leaves. But they grew louder, more insistent. I turned to run, but the forest had changed around me. The trees were closer together, their bark black and pulsing with that eerie inner light. I checked my GPS, trying to retrace my steps, but the screen was a jumble of nonsensical symbols. In my panic, I dropped it, the device disappearing into the spongy forest floor. The whispers were all around me now, no longer indistinct but terrifyingly clear. "You came back," they said. "We knew you would. No one escapes Shadow Lake forever." I ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and skin, but no matter which way I turned, I couldn't find my way out. The forest had become a labyrinth, and I was hopelessly lost. Night fell, plunging the woods into an impenetrable darkness. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me blind and terrified. I could hear movement all around me, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, and always those horrible whispers. In desperation, I fired my gun into the air, hoping the sound might scare away whatever was out there. The gunshot echoed through the trees, and for a moment everything went silent. Then slowly, a pale phosphorescent glow began to emanate from the trees themselves. In that ghostly light, I saw them. The shadow creatures. They emerged from behind trees, oozed up from the ground, coalesced from the very air itself. Dozens of them, surrounding me on all sides. Their bodies were, as I remembered, impossibly tall and thin, with too many joints bending in unnatural ways. But now I could see their faces, or rather, the lack thereof. Where features should have been, there were only swirling vortexes of absolute darkness. One of the creatures stepped forward. When it spoke, its voice was like the rustling of dead leaves. "We are the Whispers," it said. "We are the forgotten ones, the left behind, the lost. And now, Ethan Blackwood, you will join us." It reached out with arms that stretched and elongated like smoke, enveloping me in a cold, dark embrace. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I felt myself being pulled apart, my very essence unraveling like a thread being plucked from a tapestry. In that moment of dissolution, I understood. Shadow Lake was a trap, a feeding ground for these ancient, hungry entities. They lured in lost souls, fed on their fear and confusion, and ultimately absorbed them into their collective consciousness. I saw flashes of other victims, the owners of that shredded tent, hikers who had wandered off the trail, campers who had stayed one night too long. All of them now part of the Whispers, their memories and experiences added to the hive mind. As I felt the last vestiges of my individuality slipping away, a thought occurred to me, a memory of something I'd read about black holes. At their event horizon, information can neither be fully absorbed nor escape. I clung to that thought, to my sense of self, refusing to be completely assimilated. I don't know how long I existed in that state of half-absorption. It could have been days or years. Time had no meaning in that place between places, but somehow, impossibly, I came back to myself. I awoke once again in my RV, my clothes torn and dirty, my body covered in scratches and bruises. The sun was rising over Shadow Lake, its rays sparkling on the water's surface as if nothing had happened. I didn't wait around to question my miraculous escape. I started the RV and drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I was hundreds of miles away. It's been 5 years since that second encounter with the Whispers of Shadow Lake. I've tried to move on, to forget, but I know now that's impossible, because I didn't escape, not really. A part of me is still there, trapped in that dark forest, and a part of them came back with me. Sometimes when I look in the mirror, I see a swirling darkness behind my eyes. Sometimes I hear the whispers in my head, calling me back. And sometimes, just sometimes, I feel an overwhelming urge to share this story, to lure others to Shadow Lake. Because that's how they spread, that's how they feed, and now I'm one of them. So let this be a final warning. If you ever find yourself near a place called Shadow Lake, turn back. Don't let curiosity get the better of you. Don't listen to the whispers, because once you do, you'll never truly leave, and neither will they. The merciless sun beat down on the cracked earth, its relentless glare creating shimmering mirages on the horizon. I wiped the sweat from my brow and squinted at the vast expanse before me. The Nevada desert stretched out in all directions, a sea of sand and rock that seemed to go on forever. My name is Marcus Holloway, and I had come here seeking solitude, a respite from the chaos of my life in Los Angeles. Little did I know that this desolate landscape would become the stage for a nightmare beyond my wildest imagination. I'd always been a bit of an outsider, more comfortable with books and solitary pursuits than the frenetic energy of social gatherings. The city had worn me down over the years, its constant noise and frantic pace grating on my nerves until I felt like I was constantly on edge. When I inherited my uncle's old RV, it seemed like a sign. I took a leave of absence from my job as a librarian and set out for the desert, hoping to find some peace and maybe rediscover a part of myself that had been lost in the urban jungle. The spot I chose was remote, about 60 miles from the nearest town of Coyote Flats. I'd found it on an old map, tucked away in a dusty corner of the library's archives. It was perfect, far enough from civilization to ensure privacy, but not so isolated that I couldn't make it back to town if needed. As I maneuvered the RV down the bumpy dirt road, I felt a sense of anticipation building in my chest. This was it, my great escape. I parked the RV near a small outcropping of rocks that provided some shelter from the wind. The silence was immediate and all-encompassing. No traffic noise, no chattering voices, just the whisper of the breeze and the occasional cry of a distant bird. I took a deep breath, savoring the clean, dry air. This was exactly what I needed. That first evening, I set up a small camp outside the RV. I built a fire, more for company than warmth, and settled into a folding chair with a battered copy of Thoreau's Walden. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and purples, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. This was what I had been missing, this connection to nature, to silence, to myself. I slept better that night than I had in years, lulled by the absolute quiet of the desert. When I woke, the sun was just peeking over the eastern horizon, casting long shadows across the sandy ground. I made a simple breakfast of instant coffee and oatmeal, then set out to explore my surroundings. The desert, I discovered, was far from the barren wasteland many imagined it to be. It was teeming with life, albeit of a hardier variety than I was used to. Cacti stood like sentinels, their spiny arms reaching for the sky. Small lizards darted between rocks, their scales glinting in the sunlight. I even spotted a coyote in the distance, its lean form slinking across the landscape. As I walked, I began to notice signs of human presence. Old tin cans, weathered and rusted, peeked out from beneath the sand. Here and there I saw the remnants of what might have been structures, a few rotting boards, a rusted pipe sticking out of the ground. It was clear that people had lived here once, perhaps during the mining boom of the previous century. My curiosity piqued. I decided to venture further from camp. I packed a backpack with water, some trail mix, and a first aid kit. As an afterthought, I added the small .22 caliber pistol I'd brought along for protection. I'd never been much for guns, but the desert could be dangerous, and it paid to be prepared. I hiked for several hours, the sun climbing higher in the sky as the day wore on. The landscape slowly changed, becoming more rugged. Small hills gave way to larger ones, and I found myself navigating narrow gullies carved by long-gone flash floods. It was in one of these gullies that I made my first unsettling discovery. At first I thought it was just another piece of debris, perhaps part of an old machine left behind by miners, but as I got closer, I realized what I was looking at. A human skull partially buried in the sand. My heart rate quickened as I knelt beside it. The bone was yellowed and cracked, clearly very old. I debated whether to touch it, my natural inclination to preserve historical artifacts warring with a creeping sense of unease. In the end, curiosity won out. I carefully brushed away some of the sand, revealing more of the skull. That's when I noticed the hole, perfectly round, about the size of a quarter, right in the center of the forehead. This person hadn't died of natural causes. They had been murdered. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. Should I report this to the authorities? But how would I even begin to explain where I'd found it? And how long ago had this happened? For all I knew, this person had died a century ago. As I stood there trying to decide what to do, I had the distinct feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was nothing, just the empty desert stretching out in all directions. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the discovery of the skull had just rattled me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I decided to head back to camp, marking the location of the skull on my GPS app so I could find it again if needed. The walk back seemed to take twice as long as the hike out. Every sound made me jump, every shadow seemed to move. By the time I reached the RV, the sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the desert floor. I locked myself in the RV that night, the shades drawn tight. Sleep eluded me, my mind replaying the image of the skull over and over. When I did finally drift off, my dreams were filled with shadowy figures and the sound of gunshots echoing across empty landscapes. The next morning I woke to an unsettling silence. Even the ever-present wind seemed to have died down. I made myself a strong cup of coffee, trying to shake off the lingering unease from the night before. As I sipped the bitter liquid, I tried to decide what to do next. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, to put this whole experience behind me. But another part, the part that had always been drawn to mysteries and untold stories, wanted to dig deeper. In the end, curiosity won out. I decided to explore further to see if I could find any more clues about the skull's origin. This time I packed more carefully, extra water, a proper first aid kit, and my pistol, which I tucked into my waistband with a mixture of reassurance and discomfort. I set out in a different direction this time, heading towards a cluster of hills I'd spotted in the distance. The going was tougher here, the ground rockier and more uneven. By midday I was sweating profusely, my shirt sticking to my back in the relentless heat. It was then that I saw it. A glint of metal in the distance, out of place among the natural hues of the desert. As I got closer, I realized what I was looking at. The remains of an old cabin, its metal roof partially collapsed but still reflecting the sunlight. The cabin was in a state of advanced decay. The wooden walls were weathered and warped, with gaps large enough to see through in places. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, creaking softly in the faint breeze. Despite its dilapidated state, it was clear that this had once been someone's home. I approached cautiously, alert for any signs of danger. The area around the cabin was littered with debris. Old cans, broken glass, scraps of sun-bleached fabric. I peered through one of the gaps in the wall, trying to get a sense of the interior. What I saw made my blood run cold. The inside of the cabin was a scene of violence frozen in time. Furniture was overturned, debris scattered everywhere, and there, in the center of the floor, was a dark stain that could only be blood. My heart pounding, I pushed open the door. It gave way with a groan, releasing a cloud of dust that made me cough. The smell hit me immediately, a musty, decayed odor that spoke of years of abandonment. But underneath that was another scent, faint but unmistakable, the metallic tang of old blood. I stepped inside, my eyes slowly adjusting to the gloom. The bloodstain on the floor was larger than I'd initially thought, spreading out in a gruesome pattern. But it wasn't the only sign of violence. The walls were pockmarked with what looked like bullet holes, and I spotted several spent shell casings scattered among the debris. What had happened here? My mind raced with possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. A robbery gone wrong, a family dispute that had turned deadly, or something even more sinister. As I moved further into the cabin, something caught my eye. There, partially hidden beneath an overturned table, was a book. I knelt down and carefully extracted it, brushing off years of dust and grime. It was a diary, its leather cover cracked and faded, but still intact. With trembling hands, I opened it. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the handwriting was still legible. It belonged to a woman named Eleanor, and as I began to read, her story unfolded before me. Eleanor and her husband Thomas had come to the desert in the 1970s, drawn by the promise of a simpler life away from the chaos of the city. They'd built this cabin with their own hands, determined to carve out a life in this harsh landscape. For a while they'd been happy here despite the challenges, but then things had started to change. Eleanor wrote of a man they'd encountered on one of their supply runs to town, a drifter with cold eyes and an unsettling smile. Thomas had offered him some work, helping to repair a fence that had been damaged in a storm. It was a decision they would come to regret. The man, who called himself Jack, had seemed pleasant enough at first. But as the days wore on, Eleanor noticed a change in him. He became possessive, constantly watching her when Thomas wasn't around. She wrote of feeling afraid, of locking the doors at night and jumping at every sound. The final entry was dated October 15, 1978. Eleanor's normally neat handwriting was shaky. The words rushed. "He's here. God help us, Jack's here and Thomas isn't back from town. I can hear him outside calling my name. What does he want? Why won't he leave us alone? I'm so scared. If anyone finds this, please tell our families we love them. And whatever you do, don't trust." The entry ended abruptly, a long scrawl trailing off the page as if Eleanor had been interrupted mid-sentence. My hands were shaking as I closed the diary. What had happened to Eleanor and Thomas? And who was this Jack? A noise outside snapped me back to the present. It was faint, barely audible, but in the stillness of the desert it might as well have been a gunshot. I froze, straining my ears. There it was again, the crunch of footsteps on sandy ground. I moved to the window, peering out cautiously. At first I saw nothing but the empty desert, then movement caught my eye. A figure, tall and lean, was walking towards the cabin. Even from this distance I could see that it was a man, his gait slow and purposeful. Panic gripped me. Who was this person? What were they doing out here in the middle of nowhere, and why were they coming towards the cabin? I looked around frantically, searching for a place to hide. The cabin was small, with little in the way of cover. In desperation, I wedged myself into a small space between an old wardrobe and the wall, praying I wouldn't be seen. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it could be heard. The door creaked open, and a shadow fell across the floor. "I know you're in here," a voice called out, low and gravelly. "I saw you come in. Why don't you come out and we can have a chat?" I remained frozen, too terrified to move. The footsteps resumed, moving slowly around the cabin. I could hear things being shifted, pushed aside. "You've been poking around where you shouldn't," the voice continued. "Found things that weren't meant to be found. That's not very polite, is it?" A bead of sweat trickled down my forehead. How did he know what I'd found? Who was this man? Suddenly, the wardrobe I was hiding behind was yanked away. I found myself staring up at a man who seemed to fill the entire doorway. He was older, probably in his 60s, with weathered skin and cold, piercing eyes. And he was smiling, a chilling, predatory smile that made my blood run cold. "Well, well," he said, his voice deceptively friendly. "What do we have here? A curious little mouse sneaking around where he doesn't belong." I scrambled to my feet, my hand instinctively going to the pistol at my waist. The man's eyes followed the movement, his smile widening. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said softly. "Things might get messy." "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. "What do you want?" The man chuckled, a sound devoid of any real humor. "Who am I? I'm the caretaker, you might say. Been watching over this place for, quite a while now. As for what I want," his eyes hardened, "I want you to forget what you've seen here. Pack up your little camper and go back to wherever you came from. Forget about the skull. Forget about this cabin. Forget about everything." My mind was racing. Could this be Jack? But that was impossible. Jack would be an old man by now if he was even still alive. Unless... "You're him, aren't you?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're Jack." The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold anger. "You've been reading things you shouldn't," he said. "That diary, it tells lies." Eleanor, she didn't understand. None of them did. I was trying to protect them, you see. Protect them from the darkness out there. He took a step towards me, and I instinctively backed away. "But you," he continued, "you're just like the others. Always poking, always prying. Can't leave well enough alone." I felt my back hit the wall. There was nowhere left to retreat. "What others?" I asked, trying to keep him talking while I frantically tried to think of a way out of this situation. Jack's eyes took on a distant look. "So many over the years," he mused. "Hikers, campers, treasure hunters, all of them stumbling around, disturbing things best left alone. I tried to warn them, tried to make them understand, but they never listened. In the end, I had to take care of them." A chill ran down my spine as the implications of his words sank in. This man was a killer, had been for decades, and now I was his next target. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I lunged to the side, ducking under Jack's outstretched arm. He snarled, spinning around with surprising agility for a man his age. I felt his fingers brush my shirt as I dove through the open door. The sun momentarily blinded me as I burst out of the cabin. I ran, not caring which direction, just needing to put distance between myself and Jack. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps pounding on the hard-packed earth. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. Jack was closer than I'd thought, his face twisted into a mask of rage. In his hand glinted something metal, a knife, its blade catching the sunlight. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. The terrain was treacherous, loose rocks threatening to turn an ankle with every step. But fear drove me on, the knowledge that slowing down meant certain death. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning, narrowing down to the rhythm of my feet hitting the ground and the ragged sound of my breathing. The sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes. Finally, I couldn't go on. My legs gave out and I collapsed, rolling down a small incline before coming to rest in a shallow gully. I lay there, gasping for air, every muscle screaming in protest. For a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Then silence. No footsteps, no angry shouts. Had I lost him? I forced myself to my feet, wincing at the pain in my overexerted muscles. Slowly, cautiously, I peered over the edge of the gully. The desert stretched out before me, empty and indifferent. There was no sign of Jack. Relief washed over me, quickly followed by a new wave of panic. I was lost. In my blind flight, I'd paid no attention to where I was going. The sun was lower in the sky now, the shadows lengthening. Night in the desert was dangerous enough without a murderous caretaker on the loose. I needed to find my way back to the RV. But which way? I spun in a slow circle trying to get my bearings. Everything looked the same. Rocks, sand, sparse vegetation. No landmarks, nothing to guide me. As the last rays of sunlight faded, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here. I picked a direction that I hoped would lead me back towards my camp and started walking. The desert at night was a different world. The heat of the day gave way to a bone-chilling cold. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft crunch of my footsteps and the occasional cry of a distant coyote. The moon cast an eerie glow over the landscape, transforming familiar shapes into alien silhouettes. I walked for what felt like hours, each step a battle against exhaustion and fear. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every sound a potential danger. More than once, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, only to turn and find nothing but empty desert. It was nearing midnight when I saw it, a faint glow on the horizon. Hope surged through me. Was it my campfire? Had I somehow found my way back? I quickened my pace, ignoring the protests of my aching body. As I got closer, the glow resolved itself into individual points of light. Not a campfire, but windows. I'd stumbled upon a building of some kind. Relief turned to confusion, then to dread. There shouldn't be any buildings out here. This far from town, in the middle of the desert, what could this be? Caution warred with desperation. I needed help, needed to get out of this desert. But after what I'd experienced, I knew the dangers of trusting appearances out here. In the end, the cold and my exhaustion made the decision for me. I approached the building slowly, alert for any sign of danger. It was an old motel, the kind you might have seen on Route 66 in its heyday. A neon sign, half its letters dark, proclaimed it as the Desert Oasis Motel. The paint was peeling, the windows grimy, but there were definitely lights on inside. I made my way to the office, my footsteps echoing in the empty parking lot. A bell jingled as I pushed open the door, the sound jarringly cheerful in the oppressive silence. The office was small and cluttered, dominated by a large desk. Behind it sat a woman, her hair a shock of white against deeply tanned skin. She looked up as I entered, her eyes widening slightly. "Well," she said, her voice raspy as if from disuse, "don't see many visitors these days, especially not ones who look like they've been through the ringer. You all right, hun?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Now that I was here, in the presence of another person, the events of the past few days came crashing down on me. I felt myself sway, darkness creeping in at the edges of my vision. The last thing I remember is the woman's concerned face as she rushed around the desk towards me. Then, blackness. I woke to the sound of voices. For a moment I couldn't remember where I was or how I'd gotten there. Then it all came flooding back. The cabin, Jack, my desperate flight through the desert. I kept my eyes closed, straining to make out what was being said. There were two voices, the raspy voice of the woman from the office, and a deeper male voice that sent a chill down my spine. "Can't keep doing this, Jack," the woman was saying. "People are going to start asking questions." "People have been asking questions for years, Marge," the man Jack replied. "Doesn't mean they ever find answers." I felt my heart rate quicken. Jack was here. Somehow he'd known where I'd end up, or had he led me here? "This one's different," Marge said. "He knows things, saw things he shouldn't have." "All the more reason to take care of him," Jack growled. "Can't have him running back to civilization with tales of what he's seen. You know what's at stake." There was a long pause. When Marge spoke again, her voice was resigned. "Fine, but make it quick and clean. I'm tired of scrubbing blood out of the carpets." I heard footsteps approaching, and I knew I was out of time. I opened my eyes, taking in my surroundings in a split second. I was in a motel room lying on a bed. The door was to my left, about 10 feet away. As the doorknob began to turn, I launched myself off the bed. I hit the door just as it was opening, slamming it back into whoever was on the other side. There was a grunt of pain and surprise. I didn't wait to see who it was. I ran, my bare feet slapping against the cold concrete of the walkway. Behind me I could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit. The parking lot was just ahead. If I could make it there, maybe I could find a car, something to get me out of here. I was halfway across the lot when headlights suddenly blazed to life, momentarily blinding me. I threw up a hand to shield my eyes, stumbling to a halt. The driver's door of the truck opened and a figure stepped out. As my eyes adjusted, I saw it was a man in a police uniform. Relief flooded through me. "Help!" I shouted. "Please, you have to help me." The officer approached slowly, one hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Sir," he said calmly, "I'm going to need you to calm down and explain what's going on." Words poured out of me in a rush. I told him about the skull I'd found, the cabin, Jack's pursuit, and my flight through the desert. As I spoke, I saw confusion, then concern cross the officer's face. When I finished, there was a moment of silence. Then the officer spoke, his voice gentle. "Sir, I think you'd better come with me. We'll get this all sorted out." Relief washed over me. Finally, someone who would listen, who could help. I took a step towards the police car. A sharp pain exploded in the back of my head. The world tilted, then went dark. I drifted in and out of consciousness. Fragments of conversation reached me, disjointed and confusing. Really necessary? Can't risk it. Too much at stake. Dump him out past the old mines. No one goes out there anymore. I felt myself being moved, the sensation of being in a moving vehicle. Then stillness and the feel of rough ground beneath me. When I finally managed to open my eyes, I was alone. The desert stretched out around me, vast and uncaring. In the distance, I could see the headlights of a vehicle receding, growing smaller until they disappeared over the horizon. I tried to move and found that I couldn't. My wrists and ankles were bound with duct tape. Panic rose in my throat, threatening to choke me. As the full moon rose higher in the sky, casting its cold light over the desert, a terrible realization settled over me. No one knew where I was. No one was coming to look for me. Out here in the vastness of the desert, I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The desert holds many secrets. Some are written in the rocks and sand, waiting to be discovered by those who know how to read them. Others are darker, hidden away in forgotten cabins and remote motels. And some secrets, like the fate of a curious librarian who ventured too far into the wilderness, are destined to remain forever unknown, lost in the endless expanse of sand and sky. As consciousness began to fade once more, my last thoughts were of the city I'd left behind. The noise, the crowds, the constant bustle that I'd been so eager to escape now seemed like a distant paradise. In my search for solitude, I'd found something far more terrifying, a silence so complete, so absolute, that it threatened to swallow me whole. The desert wind picked up, whispering across the sand. In its soft susurration, I thought I heard a voice, Jack's voice, repeating the warning he'd given me in the cabin. Forget what you've seen here. Forget about the skull. Forget about the cabin. Forget about everything. But as the darkness closed in, I knew that forgetting was a luxury I would never have. The desert had claimed me, body and soul, and its secrets would be mine to keep for eternity. You know that sense of excitement when you finally take your RV out after a long work week? Yeah, that's the feeling I had driving up to Raven's Gorge, a secluded spot in the Montana wilderness. This wasn't my first time RV camping, but it was definitely the first time I chose to do it solo. My wife, Emma, and our kids, Liam and Zoe, had other plans, so I figured why not have a little adventure of my own. The campsite at Raven's Gorge was everything an outdoor enthusiast could dream of. Towering pines, the sound of a distant stream, and an eerie quietness that made you feel like the only person in the world. I parked my RV in a clearing surrounded by trees, their branches arching over like a cathedral roof. As I set up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching me from the dense forest. I tried to brush it off as just my imagination running wild. Setting up was quick, and soon enough I had my fire going, the familiar crackle bringing a sense of comfort. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, I sat back in my folding chair, letting the tranquility sink in. The shadows lengthened, stretching across the clearing like grasping fingers. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. Now, I'm not a paranoid guy, but there was something about that place that made me uneasy. Maybe it was the isolation or the way the wind seemed to whisper through the trees. Still, I tried to brush it off as the typical jitters of being alone in the wild. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with nocturnal sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, and something else. A sound I couldn't quite place, like the muffled whimper of a child. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I decided to turn in for the night, securing the RV and making sure everything was locked up tight. The fire was dying down, and the chill in the air was getting more pronounced. I crawled into my bed, the comforting hum of the RV's heater lulling me to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise, a sort of rustling sound. At first I thought it might be a deer or some other animal, but as I listened closer it became evident that whatever was making the noise was much closer and far too deliberate to be an animal. My heart started pounding, but I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I was just being paranoid. The noise grew louder, moving around the RV, scraping against the metal. It sounded like long, sharp nails dragging across the surface. I reached for the baseball bat I kept by the bed, call it a precaution, and tiptoed towards the door. My palms were sweaty, gripping the bat tightly. I felt like a character in one of those cheesy horror movies. But this was no movie. This was real, and the fear coursing through my veins was all too tangible. Peeking through the small window, I couldn't see anything but darkness. The moonlight was weak, barely illuminating the clearing. Taking a deep breath, I decided to step outside, bat at the ready. As soon as I opened the door, the cold air hit me, and my breath formed a cloud in front of me. The rustling stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence. I scanned the area, my eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. That's when I saw it, a shadow moving swiftly between the trees. It was too fast for me to make out any details, but it was definitely not human. Its movements were fluid yet unnatural, like nothing I'd ever seen before. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding braver than I felt. No response. The shadow seemed to have disappeared, leaving me standing there like an idiot, bat in hand, heart racing. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. Sleep was out of the question now. I sat in the driver's seat, bat across my lap, keeping watch through the windshield. Hours passed and the forest remained silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Just as the first light of dawn began to creep in, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching the RV. I jolted awake, grabbing the bat again and moved to the door. The footsteps stopped just outside. I could hear someone or something breathing, the sound too close for comfort. My heart pounded in my chest as I flung the door open, ready to confront whatever was out there. Standing before me was a figure, tall and gaunt, with a face that looked like it was made of bark and leaves. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly green light, and where its mouth should have been, there was only a dark, gaping hole. In its hand, it held what looked like a crude spear made from a sharpened branch. "What do you want?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. It didn't respond, just stared at me with those glowing eyes, the spear twitching in its grip. I tightened my hold on the bat, ready to defend myself. The creature took a step forward, and instinct kicked in. I swung the bat, aiming for its head, but it was quick. It dodged, and the spear came slashing towards me. I managed to deflect it with the bat, but the force knocked me off balance. The creature lunged again, and this time I wasn't so lucky. The spear grazed my arm, leaving a burning sensation in its wake. I swung wildly, catching it on the side of its head. It stumbled back, a strange thick liquid oozing from the wound. "Stay back," I yelled, adrenaline pumping through me. But it wasn't done. It came at me again, more ferocious this time. We struggled, the bat and spear clashing in a deadly dance. It managed to pin me against the side of the RV, the spear pressing dangerously close to my throat. In a desperate move, I brought my knee up into its midsection. It let out an inhuman screech, its grip loosening just enough for me to push it off. With all my strength, I swung the bat one last time, connecting with its head. There was a sickening crack, and the creature crumpled to the ground, the spear slipping from its hand. I stood there, panting, blood dripping from my arm, staring at the creature's motionless body. To my horror, it began to disintegrate before my eyes, turning into leaves and twigs that were quickly carried away by the wind. Shaken to my core, I stumbled back into the RV, grabbing my first aid kit to tend to my wound. It wasn't deep, but it burned like fire, and strange root-like patterns were spreading from the cut. Panic set in as I realized this was far beyond my understanding. I needed help, and fast. I tried to start the RV, but the engine sputtered and died. Looking out the windshield, I saw that the clearing was now surrounded by a thick, unnatural fog. The trees seemed to have closed in, their branches reaching towards the RV like gnarled hands. In the distance, I could hear more of those inhuman screeches. My mind raced, trying to figure out a plan. I was trapped in this nightmare, with no way to call for help, and no idea what I was up against. As the fog crept closer and the screeches grew louder, I realized that my solo adventure had turned into a fight for survival. And as the first of many dark shapes emerged from the mist, I gripped my bat tightly, knowing that the real horror was just beginning. As the first of many dark shapes emerged from the mist, I gripped my bat tightly, knowing that the real horror was just beginning. The creatures swarmed around the RV, their twisted forms a nightmarish blend of plant and animal. I could hear them scratching at the metal, searching for a way in. My mind raced, trying to figure out a way out of this hellish situation. That's when I remembered. I had a flare gun in the emergency kit. With shaking hands, I retrieved the flare gun and loaded it. The scratching intensified, and I could see the door beginning to buckle under the assault. It was now or never. I flung open the door and fired the flare into the sky. The bright red light illuminated the clearing, revealing dozens of the creatures surrounding me. They recoiled from the sudden burst of light, giving me a moment's reprieve. In that brief window of opportunity, I made a mad dash for the tree line. I could hear them pursuing me, their inhuman shrieks echoing through the forest. Branches whipped at my face as I ran, my lungs burning with each breath. I had no idea where I was going, only that I needed to put as much distance between myself and those things as possible. As I ran, the forest around me seemed to come alive. Roots rose from the ground, trying to trip me. Vines reached out, attempting to ensnare me. It was as if the entire forest was working with the creatures to trap me. The wound on my arm throbbed, the strange root-like patterns now spreading across my chest. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I burst through the tree line and found myself at the edge of a cliff. Below, I could see the lights of a small town, civilization, safety. But it was at least 100 feet down, with no clear path to descend. The shrieks were getting closer. I turned to see the creatures emerging from the forest, their glowing eyes fixed on me. I was trapped between them and the cliff. As they advanced, I noticed something peculiar. They were keeping their distance from a particular plant growing near the cliff's edge, a patch of white flowers that seemed to glow in the moonlight. In a desperate move, I lunged for the flowers, grabbing a handful. To my amazement, the creatures recoiled, shrieking in what sounded like pain. Emboldened, I waved the flowers at them and they retreated further. I had found their weakness, but my relief was short-lived. The ground beneath my feet began to crumble. The cliff edge, weakened by the creature's pursuit and my own weight, was giving way. In a heart-stopping moment, I felt myself falling, the world spinning around me as I plummeted towards the forest below. I crashed through branches, each impact sending waves of pain through my body. By some miracle, the dense foliage slowed my fall. I hit the ground hard. The wind knocked out of me, but I was alive. Battered, bruised, but alive. As I lay there, struggling to breathe, I heard the sound of voices and saw flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Human voices. A search party had been sent out after seeing the flare. I called out weakly, and soon I was surrounded by concerned faces. Park rangers, locals, all looking at me with a mix of relief and confusion. They rushed me to the local hospital where I spent the next week recovering from my injuries. The doctors were baffled by the root-like patterns on my skin which faded over time. I tried to tell them about the creatures, about the living forest, but they dismissed it as hallucinations brought on by a toxic plant I must have come into contact with. As I recovered, I learned that Raven's Gorge had a history of strange disappearances and unexplained phenomena. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the forest folk and the dangers of venturing too deep into the woods. Most dismissed these as local legends, but I knew the truth. When I was finally well enough to leave, I found my RV had been towed back to town. Everything was as I had left it, except for a small white flower I found pressed between the pages of my map book. A chilling reminder that what I experienced was all too real. The drive home was a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that somehow a piece of that forest had followed me. When I finally reached my house, I broke down in Emma's arms, the full weight of my experience crashing down on me. In the months that followed, I struggled with nightmares and a newfound fear of the woods. I couldn't bring myself to go camping again, much to my family's confusion. The root-like scars on my arm served as a constant reminder of my ordeal. I've since learned to cope, but I'll never forget what happened at Raven's Gorge. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can hear distant, inhuman shrieks carried on the wind. And when I look out into my backyard, I can't help but wonder, are the trees watching me? One thing's for certain, I'll never take a solo camping trip again. Some parts of nature, it seems, are better left undisturbed. And some stories are better left untold. But I've told mine now, and I can only hope that it serves as a warning to others who might think to venture into the deep, dark woods alone. Because out there in the shadows of the ancient trees, something waits, something that defies explanation, something that hungers. And if you're not careful, you might just become another legend whispered around campfires on dark nights. The suffocating embrace of Los Angeles had become too much to bear. The constant drone of traffic, the oppressive smog that hung over the city like a shroud, and the never-ending parade of people. It was all closing in on me. I, Ethan Blackwood, had always been drawn to the serenity of nature. And RV camping had become my escape from the mundane pressures of life. Growing up in the chaos of Los Angeles, I often found myself yearning for solitude and the simple pleasures of the great outdoors. That's how I ended up in the dense forests of Northern California, far away from the noise and pollution of the city. I had a knack for finding the most secluded spots where the only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the trees and the occasional call of a distant bird. As I drove my battered but reliable old Winnebago along the winding forest roads, I felt a sense of anticipation building in my chest. The farther I got from civilization, the more at peace I felt. The towering redwoods and dense undergrowth seemed to welcome me, their ancient presence a stark contrast to the sterile concrete jungle I'd left behind. After hours of driving, I finally found the perfect spot, a small clearing near a crystal-clear stream. My RV looked out of place amid the ancient trees, a modern intruder in this timeless sanctuary. But it was my home for the next few days, and I was grateful for its shelter. I had packed enough supplies to last a week: canned goods, water, a first aid kit, and my trusty rifle for protection against any wild animals. Not that I expected to encounter anything dangerous, but you can never be too careful in the wilderness. As I set up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I chalked it up to paranoia, a city dweller's natural unease in the quiet of the forest. Still, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than usual as I gathered firewood and set up my camping chair by the stream. The first day was uneventful, almost idyllic. I hiked along barely visible trails, marveling at the towering trees and the lush ferns that carpeted the forest floor. I tried my hand at fishing in the stream, more for the meditative quality of the act than any real hope of catching dinner. As the sun began to set, I returned to my campsite and built a fire. Sitting by the crackling flames, watching the sparks dance up into the darkening sky, I felt truly at peace for the first time in years. The worries and stresses of my life in Los Angeles seemed a world away. I thought about how lucky I was to have found this little slice of paradise. Little did I know this paradise would soon turn into a nightmare. I woke early the next morning to the sound of rustling leaves. It wasn't the gentle breeze of the previous day. This was something different, more purposeful. I lay still in my sleeping bag, straining my ears to catch any other sounds. For a moment I could have sworn I heard whispers, barely audible and impossible to make out. Shaking off my unease, I attributed the sounds to wildlife, perhaps a deer or a raccoon rummaging through the underbrush. I went about my morning routine, brewing coffee over the rekindled fire and enjoying a simple breakfast of instant oatmeal. As I sat reading a worn paperback thriller, I couldn't help but feel that the forest around me had changed overnight. The welcoming atmosphere of the previous day had been replaced by something more watchful. By mid-morning, I decided to go for a hike deeper into the woods. I packed a small backpack with essentials: water, snacks, a map, and my knife. After a moment's hesitation, I decided to leave the rifle behind, thinking it unnecessary for a short hike. The trail I chose was barely a trail at all, more of a game path winding through the forest. The further I went, the denser the vegetation became. Shafts of sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy overhead, creating an eerie twilight atmosphere even in the middle of the day. After about an hour of hiking, I came across something that made my blood run cold. A campsite. But not just any campsite. This one looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. There was an overturned tent, scattered belongings, and a half-burned fire. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the pounding of my own heart. I cautiously approached, calling out to see if anyone was around. My voice sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness of the forest, but there was no response. As I examined the site more closely, I found personal items strewn about: clothes, a wallet, a backpack, but no sign of the people who had left them. Among the scattered belongings, I found a journal. Its pages were filled with hastily scribbled notes that made little sense. Mentions of being watched, strange noises at night, and a final entry that simply read, "They're coming." A chill ran down my spine as I read those words, my imagination conjuring up all sorts of terrifying possibilities. I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to get back to my RV and drive as far away from here as possible. But curiosity, or perhaps some darker force, compelled me to look around a bit more. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound like a growl, but distinctly human. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned slowly, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the trees and the underbrush, silent as ever. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I saw him. A man stood a few yards away, partially obscured by the trees. He was gaunt and disheveled, his clothes torn and dirty as if he'd been living in the wilderness for weeks. But it was his eyes that truly terrified me, wild and unfocused, filled with a mix of fear and something else, something darker and more primal. "Hey," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you okay?" He didn't respond, just stood there staring at me with those unsettling eyes. I took a hesitant step closer and he bolted, disappearing into the forest with an agility that surprised me, given his apparent condition. I hesitated for a moment, weighing my options. The sensible thing would be to head back to my campsite, to the relative safety of my RV. But what if this man needed help? What if he knew something about the abandoned campsite and the cryptic journal entries? Against my better judgment, I decided to follow him. I plunged into the underbrush, pushing through ferns and ducking under low-hanging branches. The man was fast, but I managed to keep him in sight, catching glimpses of his ragged form as he darted between the trees. We emerged into another clearing, and what I saw there made me wish I'd never left Los Angeles. It was the remnants of another campsite, but this one was even more chaotic than the first. Tents were shredded, camping gear was scattered everywhere, and most disturbingly, there were dark stains on the ground that looked horribly like blood. The air was thick with the metallic scent of fear, and I could feel my heart racing, every instinct screaming at me to run. But the man was gone, vanished into the trees like a ghost. I stood there, panting and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I felt a sharp pain in the back of my head, and everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but when I came to, I found myself in a nightmarish situation. I was tied to a tree, my hands bound behind me with rough rope that bit into my skin. My head throbbed where I'd been struck, and my vision swam as I tried to focus on my surroundings. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized I was in some sort of makeshift camp. Crude shelters made of branches and animal hides surrounded me, and in the center was a fire pit, currently cold and empty. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, unwashed bodies, and something else, a sickly sweet odor I couldn't quite identify. Movement caught my eye, and I saw him, the man from the forest. He was crouched by one of the shelters, muttering to himself as he sorted through a pile of what looked like bones. As if sensing my gaze, he turned and our eyes met. He approached slowly, his movements jerky and unpredictable. Up close, I could see that his eyes were sunken and bloodshot, his skin pale and covered in a network of scars and fresh cuts. He crouched down in front of me, his face inches from mine. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "This place isn't for you, the forest. It doesn't like outsiders." "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay calm. "What happened to the other campers?" He didn't answer, just stared at me with those wild eyes. Then he stood up and walked over to what I now realized was a makeshift altar. It was covered in strange symbols carved into wood and bone, and adorned with feathers, teeth, and other unidentifiable objects. He picked up a knife from the altar, its blade wickedly sharp and stained with what I prayed wasn't blood. As he approached me again, I struggled against my bonds, the rope cutting into my wrists. "The forest demands sacrifice," he muttered, raising the knife. "It's hungry, always hungry." I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the pain that was sure to come. But instead, I heard a loud crack, like a gunshot, and the man's body fell heavily to the ground beside me. I opened my eyes to see another man standing at the edge of the clearing, a rifle in his hands. He was older, probably in his 60s, with a grizzled beard and the weathered look of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. He approached cautiously, keeping his eyes on the man on the ground. He nudged him with his foot to make sure he was dead, then turned to me. "You all right, son?" he asked, his voice gruff but kind. I think so," I replied, still in shock from the rapid turn of events. He quickly cut me loose, and I stumbled to my feet, rubbing my raw wrists. "Thank you," I managed to say. "Who are you, and who was he?" The old man sighed heavily. "Name's Frank. I'm a park ranger. Been tracking this fella for weeks now. As for who he was, well, that's a long story. Let's get you back to your camp first. You look like you could use a strong drink and a sit-down." As we made our way back through the forest, Frank explained that there had been reports of missing campers in the area over the past few months. At first they thought it was just careless hikers getting lost, but then they started finding abandoned campsites and signs of struggle. "We knew something was wrong," Frank said, "but we had no idea it was this bad. That fella back there, he wasn't always like that. Used to be a camper himself, name of Mike Holloway. Came out here about 6 months ago and never left. We reached my campsite as the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. I was relieved to see my RV still there, untouched. Frank helped me inside and I collapsed into a chair, my legs finally giving out as the adrenaline wore off. Frank rummaged through my supplies and found a bottle of whiskey I'd brought along. He poured us each a generous measure and sat down across from me. "Now," he said, taking a long sip of his drink, "I reckon you've got some questions, and I've got a story to tell you. A story about this forest and the things that live in it. Things that most folks don't believe in, things that don't show up in any guidebook or nature documentary." I leaned forward, my own drink forgotten in my hand. "What kind of things?" Frank's eyes grew distant, as if he was looking at something far beyond the walls of my RV. "Things as old as the trees themselves, maybe older. They've been here long before we started coming into these woods, and they'll be here long after we're gone. Most of the time, they're content to leave us alone. But sometimes they get hungry." As the night deepened around us, Frank spun a tale that sounded more like something out of a horror novel than real life. He spoke of ancient spirits that dwelled in the oldest parts of the forest, entities that had been worshipped by the native tribes long before European settlers arrived. "These spirits," Frank explained, "they're not good or evil in the way we think of it. They're like forces of nature, powerful, unpredictable, and completely indifferent to human concerns. But they do get restless sometimes, and when that happens, they start to influence the world around them." He went on to describe how, over the years, there had been cycles of strange occurrences in the forest, periods where hikers would go missing more frequently, where rangers and locals would report odd sightings or inexplicable phenomena. "And sometimes," Frank said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, "sometimes they find someone who's susceptible, someone they can use." I thought back to the wild-eyed man who had held me captive. "You mean like Mike Holloway?" Frank nodded grimly. "Exactly like Mike. He came out here 6 months ago, just a regular guy looking to commune with nature. But something about him caught the attention of the forest spirits. Maybe he was more open to their influence, or maybe he just happened to camp in the wrong spot. Whatever the reason, they got into his head." The ranger described how Mike had gradually changed over the weeks he spent in the forest. At first it was just small things, talking to himself, building strange structures out of sticks and bones. But as time went on, he became more erratic, more violent. "We tried to help him," Frank said, a note of regret in his voice. "Tried to convince him to leave the forest, to get some help. But by then it was too late. He was convinced that the forest was speaking to him, that it needed sacrifices to stay strong." I shuddered, remembering Mike's words about the forest being hungry. "So all those missing campers?" Frank nodded solemnly. "Some of them probably just got lost, but others, well, you saw those campsites, and there were others we found that were even worse." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of Frank's words hanging heavy in the air. Finally, I asked the question that had been nagging at me since he first appeared. "Why are you telling me all this? Isn't there some kind of cover-up? I can't imagine the Parks Department wants this kind of story getting out." Frank chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Son, I've been working these woods for over 40 years. I've seen things that would turn your hair white. And I've learned that sometimes the truth is the only thing that can keep people safe. I'm telling you this because you need to understand the danger. You need to respect this forest and the things that live in it." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "And most importantly, you need to leave. First thing in the morning, you pack up and you drive out of here. Don't stop, don't look back, just go." I nodded, a chill running down my spine despite the warmth of the RV. "What about you, and what about what happened today?" "I'll take care of it," Frank said, standing up. "I've got protocols for this kind of situation. As far as anyone else will know, Mike Holloway was a disturbed individual who tragically died while camping. A cautionary tale about the dangers of going into the wilderness unprepared." He moved to the door of the RV, pausing with his hand on the handle. "Remember what I said. Leave at first light. And if you ever feel the urge to come back to these woods, fight it. For your own sake." With that, he was gone, swallowed up by the darkness of the forest. I barely slept that night, every creak and rustle outside the RV setting my nerves on edge. When the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I was already up and packing. As I prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest that had seemed so welcoming just days ago now felt oppressive, its shadows hiding untold horrors. I moved quickly, breaking down my campsite and stowing everything in the RV. Every so often I would pause, certain I'd heard a whisper on the wind or caught a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. But each time I turned to look, there was nothing there but trees and underbrush. As I was doing a final check of the area, making sure I hadn't left anything behind, I noticed something strange. At the base of a large tree near where I'd parked the RV, there was a small pile of stones arranged in a deliberate pattern. I was certain it hadn't been there the day before. I approached cautiously, my heart racing. The stones were arranged in a spiral, with a larger flat stone in the center. Carved into this central stone was a crude symbol, a tree with what looked like faces peering out from its branches. For a moment I considered taking the stone as evidence of my experience, but Frank's warnings echoed in my mind, and I decided it was best to leave it undisturbed. Whatever message it was meant to convey, I didn't want to know. With a final glance at the forest that had been my home for the past few days, I climbed into the RV and started the engine. As I pulled away from the clearing, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing among the trees, tall and inhuman, its body seeming to shift and blend with the forest around it. But when I blinked, it was gone. I drove faster than was probably safe on the winding forest roads, not slowing until I reached the main highway. Only then did I feel like I could breathe again, the oppressive atmosphere of the forest finally lifting. The drive back to Los Angeles was long and uneventful, giving me plenty of time to think about what had happened. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as a bad dream or a hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But the rope burns on my wrists and the lump on the back of my head were very real reminders that what I'd experienced was no dream. For weeks after my return, I was jumpy and paranoid. Every unexpected sound made me flinch, and I found myself avoiding parks and even well-manicured lawns. The concrete jungle of LA, which I had been so eager to escape, now felt comfortingly solid and real. I debated whether to tell anyone about what had happened. In the end, I decided to keep it to myself. Who would believe me anyway? A tale of ancient forest spirits and murderous hermits sounded insane even to my own ears. I did, however, keep an eye on the news, searching for any reports of missing hikers or strange occurrences in the area where I had camped. There were a few stories, a lost hiker here, an abandoned campsite there, but nothing that hinted at the true horrors lurking in those woods. About a month after my return, I received a package. There was no return address, but the postmark was from a small town near the forest where I had camped. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside was a small, smooth stone, similar to the ones I had seen arranged in that strange pattern. Carved into its surface was the same symbol, the tree with faces in its branches. Wrapped around the stone was a note, written in a shaky hand. Remember, respect, never return. I recognized Frank's handwriting from the maps he had shown me. The message was clear. This was both a warning and a reminder. The forest and its spirits were real, and they were not to be trifled with. Years have passed since that fateful camping trip, and I've done my best to put it behind me. I moved away from Los Angeles, seeking a fresh start in a bustling East Coast city where the tallest things around me are skyscrapers, not ancient trees. I've never gone camping again. The call of the wild that once drew me so strongly now fills me with dread. But sometimes, especially on quiet nights when the wind rustles through the city trees, I find myself thinking about that forest. I wonder about Frank, the grizzled old ranger who saved my life. Is he still out there, protecting unsuspecting campers from horrors they can't imagine? Or has he too fallen victim to the hungry spirits of the woods? And I think about Mike Holloway, the man who had been so thoroughly claimed by the forest. Was he truly gone, or was some part of him still out there, wandering the shadowy paths between the trees? Most of all, I think about the spirits themselves. Are they confined to that one forest, or are they everywhere, watching and waiting from every patch of wilderness? The thought keeps me awake some nights, staring out my window at the city lights and imagining what might be hiding in the darkness beyond. I keep the carved stone Frank sent me on my desk as a constant reminder, not just of the danger I survived, but of the thin veil that separates our mundane world from forces we can barely comprehend. It serves as a warning to respect the wild places of the world and to never underestimate the power of nature, both seen and unseen. Sometimes when I'm alone in my apartment, I could swear I hear whispers, faint and just on the edge of comprehension. In those moments, I'm transported back to that forest, surrounded by ancient trees and watched by hungry spirits. And I wonder, did I ever truly escape, or did a part of me remain there, forever wandering those dark and secret paths? As I sit here, writing down this account of my experience, I can't help but feel that I'm being watched, not by anything in this city, but by something far away, patient and ancient. And I know with a certainty that chills me to my core, that somewhere in a distant forest, the spirits are stirring once again, awaiting their next unsuspecting visitor. Remember, respect, never return. These words have become my mantra, a shield against the lingering whispers of the forest. But even as I repeat them, I can't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, the forest will call me back. And when it does, will I have the strength to resist? Months after I finished writing my account, I received another package. This one was larger, heavier. Inside, I found a collection of journals, their pages yellowed with age and warped by moisture. A note tucked inside the cover read simply, "Found these in an old ranger station. Thought you should have them. F." As I read through the journals, a chill settled over me. They contained accounts dating back decades, all telling similar stories to mine. Campers, hikers, and rangers who had encountered something inexplicable in the forest. Some had escaped, like me. Others hadn't been so lucky. The final entry in the last journal caught my eye. It was dated just a few weeks ago, written in a hand I recognized, Frank's. "I'm getting too old for this," he had written. "Been fighting these woods for too long. It's someone else's turn now. Leaving these journals for the next poor soul who needs to know the truth. God help them." The entry ended there. I tried to contact Frank to find out what had happened to him, but it was as if he had vanished into thin air. The ranger station where he had worked had no record of him. It was as if he had never existed. As I sit here now, surrounded by these journals full of forgotten horrors, I realize that I'm part of something larger than myself, a cycle of discovery, terror, and warning that has been repeating for generations. I don't know what compelled Frank to send me these journals, or what has become of him, but I do know this. The story of the forest and its spirits isn't over. It will never be over. There will always be those who are drawn to the wilderness, seeking escape or enlightenment. And there will always be something waiting for them, hungry and patient. So I'll do what Frank did. I'll keep these journals safe, adding my own account to their pages. And if someday someone comes to me with wild eyes and a tale of terror from the woods, I'll pass this knowledge on. Because in the end, that's all we can do. Warn those who will listen, and hope that it's enough to keep the hungry spirits at bay. But even as I write these final words, I can hear it, a faint whisper, like wind through distant trees. And I wonder, not for the first time, if the forest has truly let me go, or if it's just biding its time, waiting for the day when I can no longer resist its call. Remember, respect, never return. The mantra echoes in my mind, a desperate prayer against the encroaching whispers. But will it be enough? Only time will tell. Hello, friends. About 70% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you all.